a diet low in whole grains is the biggest risk factor for diet-related chronic disease.
We've got to take a tangent here. So walk us through whole grains and then what is not whole grain,
right?
Like in the breads that we get from the store.
There's this beautiful piece of research that like listed all the dietary factors that contribute to diet-related chronic diseases, and you'd expect it to be like diet high in red meats at the top, but it's not actually.
Right.
Diet low in whole grains.
Diet low in whole grains.
Wow.
Diet low in nuts and seeds. Diet low in omega-3 fatty acids. Diet low in pulses. They all come. Diet low in whole fruits. Actually, that's higher. Diet low in whole fruits is either 2 or 3. And I want to go back to that because everyone's scared of fruit now.
Yep.
They all come before you get to diet high in red meat, diet high in processed meat, diet high in saturated fat.
Wow.
So, but why? Right? People have taken these foods off their plates and either have ultra processed food on the plate or they have like a lot of meat on the plate. Yeah. So what we're missing from the plate, because when you take some, like we always eat the food unless we're like heavily restricted. So if you have ultra processed foods on your plate, something's coming off.
Right.
If you're adding a huge steak to your plate, something's coming off because there's only so much we can eat, right? So whole grains, barley, pearled barley, spelt, buckwheat, quinoa, those are the top ones.
Welcome to the Better Brain Podcast, where we talk about everything brain health for anyone who has a brain or knows somebody who does and wants to make it better.
Today's guest is Dr. Frederica Amati. Dr. Amati is a nutritionist. She's a scientist. She's a Sunday Times bestselling author and the head nutritionist at Zoe. She has over a decade of experience in public health and working with individuals to optimize their nutrition for a long and healthy life. She has a new book out called Everybody Should Know This, which I highly recommend. And most importantly, here we have Dr. Frederica Amati.
You know, we're excited to have you on the podcast, obviously. It's going to be an exciting podcast because you're very practical. You don't just have the scientific knowledge and the expertise and the training, but you're boots on the ground with patients and with your kids. Yeah. And to hear you on different podcasts talking about how you would advise other parents to work around some of these challenging questions with nutrition is really inspiring. Yeah. One of the podcasts I heard you on was the Food Fight podcast, where you gave your origin story about the multiple careers you had before you landed on nutrition science. And I thought that was inspiring, super relatable for people like us who've changed career paths or anyone in pursuit of a career. And you know, the one thing that stuck with me from that podcast was how you said that nutrition was the most powerful tool for public health. Yeah. And I think that represents your view in a way, and your expertise, your background, your path. Maybe we can start the podcast here talking about nutrition as the most powerful tool for public health. Unpack that a little bit. Tell us why you think that.
Yeah, so I think when we think about improving public health, which is just this idea of like population medicine, so how can we influence outcomes for a variety of people at the same time? When I was studying public health, there was, you know, various things that you can look at. It's like access to healthcare is really important. Education is really important. Socioeconomic status impacts everything. But I was trying to see, like, what's the most useful thing that we can actually help people change that will have a measurable impact now, as opposed to sort of with some of the other changes, it'll take a couple of generations to see the impact. And so I was being taught about cancer epidemiology and like all of these various ways that we know lifestyle impacts cancer outcomes. And of course, everyone knows about smoking and cancer. And then I had this lecture by Professor Elia Ribberly, and he's like the leader of EPIC, the big cohort trial on cancer. And he was like, yes, and so we know that diet impacts all the cancers. And he just said it. It was just like this big study that they were publishing that year, looking at how diet influences colorectal cancer risk, was that one. So this was actually the study that went on to help move processed meats into class 1 carcinogen. And I was sitting in this lecture, and I was like a front row student, and I was staring at him, showing us the data. And I remember just looking around like, did anyone else hear that? And so he was like, yeah, so essentially if we could like just encourage people to eat less processed meats, they could reduce their risk of colorectal cancer by this much. And it was a measure.
That's it.
And I was just mind blown. So that sort of set me off on the path of finding out more. Now, at the time, Imperial College, and still now, to be honest, doesn't really have like a nutrition curriculum in the university. Yeah. It's not one of the things we teach so much. So that's why I decided to sort of find my own way. I went to Cambridge and did like a course in human nutrition there, and then decided I will do a master's after my PhD. But that started it off, and I realized that when I did my PhD, I actually focused on mental health. So mental public health was my thesis. And one of the pieces of work I did was looking at how nutrition can impact mental health outcome. Yeah. So how can we have these patients coming into treatment for, it's like talking therapies essentially. And they do work, in like just over half of people. And I was trying to find a better metric to capture improvement, because you know what it's like, it's such a harsh cutoff. It's like you're either below the line or you're above the line. So you're either depressed or you're not depressed. Right. There's like no nuance. There's no context for me. So my interest was like I'm very interested in personalized medicine and person-centered approach. So I was like, how can we actually capture the people who have made a big improvement, but their context means they're never going to be below the cutting, the point. And within that, I started looking at context, like lifestyle, whether they were displaced. So like, did they have any social connections at all? I became interested in that. And then I realized that one of the factors that really influenced well-being and like overall, also, so interestingly, also just like sense of belonging was food culture. And so like, I started looking at food and anxiety, food and depression, and like nutritional status and likelihood of recovery as a side project to my thesis. And that really then cemented this for me. And when I became pregnant with my first child, and I was like, okay, let me look at the evidence for if I need to change anything about my diet, like what is it that I need to look at? Because, by this point I was very convinced of the importance of early childhood and pregnancy exposures from the lens of ACEs, actually. So adverse childhood events is how I like got. And like 3 of the ACEs are related to food. So like food insecurity, access to healthy food. I was like, okay, so there's something there. Yeah. Let me find out if I should be doing something. And then I realized the evidence was, or like the recommendations, the public-facing recommendations for nutrition pregnancy were like contradicting each other on the same website. So the NHS, the National Health Service website, has one part of the website that says, eat oily fish, including smoked salmon, trout. And then like, the next page is avoid smoked salmon for risk of listeria. And I was like, I'm educated. Yeah. and I can see that there's something wrong here, but like, how confusing is that? Right. What am I supposed to eat? Yeah. And the medical profession, it's changing now, but they're sort of like, eat what you want, just normal diet. Or
medical
don't worry
students
about
aren't taught about this, right?
Right. So, and especially if you're working with like a consultant obstetrician, so someone who's like quite senior, they're definitely like, don't worry about it. We'll test you for diabetes later, but for now, just whatever. Just eat what you can. So, okay.
Let's circle back to that. Why don't you think that nutrition is emphasized in medical school education?
So I think, actually, I teach nutrition to medical students now. Right. So I think it's starting, right? But all the students I've taught, they'll now be in their, like, the earliest adopters that I taught, the first batch, they'll only be in 3rd year or 4th year now. So they're not doctors yet.
Just
and they
barely,
won't be.
Just barely looking at patients.
They're barely like, and they're not going to be senior for ages.
Yeah.
I think historically it's because nutrition wasn't considered a valuable tool to actually make an impact in primary, secondary or tertiary prevention. It's like, that's not going to do the thing. The pharmaceuticals will fix it. So I think it's a mix. It's hard to answer, but I think it's a mixture of the fact that the medical system is set up to fix a problem, not to prevent it. And the fact that nutrition science hadn't convinced other science that it could actually help in the disease pathway as well as just in prevention. So, and I think that's only changing in the past 5 years.
Well, it's like the rest of lifestyle medicine. You try to make a prescription for exercise and there's no such thing. There's no training.
Yeah. And even then, you're right. So some doctors might say, yeah, you need to exercise more. But if it's like, okay, but how? Like, what should I be doing? It's like, don't know.
Yeah.
30
Not sure.
minutes.
Yeah.
150 minutes a week,
Yeah,
split
exactly.
to 3 to 5 days.
Of intense exercise. What does that mean?
Yeah. So, we already spoke with Dr. Spector already, and that was a really awesome conversation. And we talked about gut health influence on mental health and even brain health. And you already brought it up, which I'm really excited to talk about. But give us your perspective on gut health, and then also how it influences mental health and brain health.
Yeah, so like it's clear that the gut microbiome is the future of how we think about, in my view, like nutrition and health, because so many effects of dietary patterns are explained by gut microbiome mediation. So I'm a big fan of the Mediterranean diet as a dietary intervention. I've written about it, I've researched it, and it's really cool. It works really well. And so, but then it's like, why does it work? It can't just be the micronutrient profiling. Like it was hard to sort of understand what exactly about those combination of foods had such a profound impact on outcomes across the lifespan. And now there's like a really niche but interesting research area on the gut microbiome being modulated by the Mediterranean dietary pattern. And that's exerting a lot of the effects, which now makes sense, right? So for me, the gut microbiome, so these trillions of microbes in our gut, and it's not just bacteria. Bacteria is the thing we know best, but we haven't even got to like the protozoa, the viruses, like the parasites. Some of the research we've done at Zoe shows that having certain parasites is actually protective. And so we need to stop thinking about parasites as just something we need to nuke out of our gut every time.
Are there any fungi?
Well, fungi, so like that's a whole, we haven't done that yet, but there's...
Do you suspect that there is?
Yes. Oh, no, there's lots of fungi. We know there's lots in there, but we haven't done the research to see how they relate to health. But it's interesting, like there's a big trend about being super scared of Candida.
Right. Mold.
Well, no. This is like a fungal infection, yeast infection.
Oh, okay, sure.
And people, like they'll get gut tests and it'll say that they have a candidiasis of the gut, which, and it's like they're actually a normal part of our gut flora. It's only a problem if it becomes like too prominent,
overgrown.
But that happens with dysbiosis. Like it's not the candida that's the problem. It's the same with H. pylori, right? Like famously H. pylori, like let's nuke it if you have it, but we don't need to. It's there. It's supposed to be there. It's only a problem if it becomes if it overgrows and causes an issue with stomach ulcers, but it doesn't always cause a problem. People can have it and be fine. So this is blastocystis, is a parasite, which historically, if you went and had it, the doctor would be like, oh my God, like take all these drugs and get rid of it. And actually in our research, not only does it do absolutely no harm, it's actually protective for blood pressure and for visceral fat. So it's like, then people were like, oh, how do I get it?
That's exactly.
Put it in a pill and give it to me.
I'm like,
Tomorrow there's going to be a supplement company.
Blastocystis supplement.
Blastocystis company.
And so, it's people often say it's a new science. It's not really. We've been looking at gut microbiome, not me personally, but like science have been looking at gut microbiome for like 20 years. It's not brand new, but it's just that there's so much to look at and to discover that it's going to be one of those sciences that continues to evolve as we find out more. It's a bit like, we still have researchers going into the Amazon and finding new species of plant. It doesn't mean that like Amazon science is new. What's exciting is that what we've now been able to do is not just map out what bacteria, like what genes are expressed in the gut. We've been able to actually say, okay, how are these relevant to health outcomes? Because I think for a lot of public opinion is like, okay, I've been told I have a really good diverse microbiome, but what does that mean? And it's true, like that doesn't tell you anything. You actually want to know whether that diversity of microbes is helpful. Is it actually helping you achieve positive health outcomes? Or do you have a diversity of microbiome that isn't helpful and is actually pro-inflammatory and you're causing yourself more harm than good? So now that's where we are. And I think the next steps, is to actually be able to recommend certain dietary changes specific to the strains that are healthy.
The challenge I have with the microbiome right now is it feels like the Human Genome Project. They're trying to map every strain in there to understand how everything's interacting with each other and with health outcomes, just as the Genome Project tried to understand human disease and behavior. and fell short by some 50+%, and I think that's why Tim had kind of shifted gears into the microbiome, hoping that the answer to human variability and diversity and why we are the way we are, and die of the diseases we do, would be found in the gut.
Right.
And so it's the new frontier in a way still, because there's still, but it also represents a field where people can come in and take advantage and say, well, this is good for your gut. And we would not know whether that's true or not, because the complexity of the microbiome is unbelievable.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say, because so for genetics, right, I think it's clear that just one gene is not the answer. In very few cases, it is the answer.
Right.
But actually with genetics, it's how the genes are expressed together and which ones you have, do you express them, how much? Mm-hmm. And I think with the gut microbiome, it's similar. It's like there's a couple of occasions actually where we have like 3 or 4 strains that are always found, for example, in colorectal cancer. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, these guys are definitely doing something. Right. But for most part, it's what does your ecosystem of microbes look like and what are they doing? So when we combine the two, this is where the magic can happen, right? So if you have a certain genetic predisposition of whatever kind, and we can understand some genetic predispositions now, Giles Yeo's work on obesity and genes, like there's a good understanding of which genes do have more of an influence. Mm-hmm. If we then take that information, the gut microbiome is like a representation of our environment, because everything we eat, breathe, swallow. Yeah. Right. So like the exposome, love that term. I was talking to my book agent. I was like, can we call that exposome? I think she's like, I like the word, right? It's like, but essentially like this idea of how do we know genetics, like, okay, we understand the genome. We know like if you have specific genetic predispositions, some of them are sealed, like a sealed fate. Very few of them are. Mm-hmm. But it's very hard to know what people are exposed to. Yep. Because they can tell you, but there's so much bias. And so it's like, and frankly, it's like, what did you eat last Tuesday? Right. I don't know.
Unless you're in the biosphere or you're having, the Zoe muffin or something like that to do a test.
Or unless you've like got a log. Right. And okay, do you know how much pollution you're exposed to where you live? And what products you use in your skin and how are your stress levels? So there's so many things, but the microbiome.
What's the gut health or the makeup of the people in your home?
Yes,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. Who are you spending time with?
Sharing straws with?
Yeah. And so what the gut microbiome offers us is an unbiased way of measuring this, because so about 55% of gut microbiome composition is modulated by diet, but the rest is other factors. Medications, right? Medications have a massive impact. Xenobiotics, so all these like emulsifiers, sweeteners, plastics that our body, we didn't evolve with, so it's like new things. So where we're getting to is like there's 2 things that are really exciting about gut microbiome. One of them is its potential to help us screen for like risk and actually then change it. So the work we're doing at the moment with cancer research is called Prospect. It's a big cohort that we're working with like international collaborators, including Mass General, and it's a huge group of us. And we're basically trying to understand what can we learn about early colorectal cancer. So under the age of 50, it's really growing rapidly. And then our team, so led by Professor Sarah Berry, we're actually going to create an intervention. So we're going to get this group of volunteers, so like in a trial, and we're going to screen their microbiome and see like, do you have some of the strains we believe are actually like problematic that could be a flag, and then can we change your microbiome composition for the better, removing that risk with dietary intervention? That's cool, because if you then get to the point where you can screen it. It's colorectal cancer is one of them, but in our research we found links with microbiome composition and things like blood pressure, which is the biggest risk factor in the world. Right. So there's all these things where we could actually come in and say, we can change this risk factor path you're on actually with your diet. So that's really cool, and we can measure if it's moving in the right direction, not just by asking you if you've changed your diet, and not just by looking at the endpoint of blood pressure, but actually seeing whether the gut microbiome is shifting, which can happen quicker than the risk factor change, right?
Yeah. How quick? I know you mentioned this before, but how quick can we expect?
So, listen, some trials have found changes in microbiome composition with a simple intervention within 48 hours. Right. The trial we ran for like Biome, which was the trial on our like fiber supplement was 6 weeks, and we saw big shifts in that time with the one dietary change. Our randomized control trial of Zoe was 14 weeks, 14 or 16 weeks. So like quite a long time, but big changes with and that's a full dietary intervention, right?
Yeah.
Very, very big changes in that time.
Yeah.
So it's exciting to be able to measure how gut microbiome composition is changing, and then the health outcomes that are changing as well. So you can literally see, and we can do mediation analysis and say, okay, we think this much of the change is actually mediated by the gut microbiome.
Right.
Yeah. So that's exciting. And then the other thing that's really exciting in the gut microbiome, which is like less exciting for, I guess, the public, but as a scientist, it's so awesome, is we can start using gut microbiome composition as a true representation of exposure. So suddenly it's like, you're telling, like, you said that you've changed these exposures, but your gut microbiome is telling me otherwise. So we published a paper on Monday that literally shows how coffee drinkers have an expression of a specific bacteria. And if you don't drink coffee, you don't have it.
This transiently changes. So if you've had coffee, then you express it more, or
so it's more that like if you're somebody who in your life drinks coffee, you have it. If you don't, it just goes. Now this is one example of one food, but we can replicate this. So we've done this with dietary pattern. Vegans, vegetarians, omnivores. We can see if you're vegan, vegetarian, omnivore. Actually quite gross, the omnivores. and I say this as somebody who like eats fish and eggs and stuff, so I do eat animals of sorts. You can tell one of the patterns for omnivores is that you actually find chicken poop microbes in their microbiome, which is like charming, isn't it? So you can tell these things, and you can also tell whether people are having a variety of healthy plants or not. So then it's like just being vegan isn't going to make you healthy if you're not actually eating a variety of plants, if you're just eating like highly processed replacement foods. And so we're getting that. And that, for me, for the future of nutrition science, I think one of the reasons why other scientists are like, well, nutrition science is really imprecise because you rely on self-reporting or on logging, and it's up to the person to do it. But now we're saying, well, actually, not far off, we'll be able to look at gut microbiome composition and know what kind of dietary pattern they're having, or even specific foods, and then also understand whether changes in medication or changes in like the environment they live in. So one of the papers we published last year looked at rural living versus city dwelling, and then who lived in your household. And it was a really lovely paper because we found that basically owning a dog
that's right.
is really helpful and like creates a good gut microbiome profile. So then, of course, I actually used that paper to convince my husband to get a dog. I was like, it's for the kids. Oh, we have a dog. The science. But I recommend that only get a dog if you can look after it, obviously. But so there's this really, we have this opportunity to start understanding in the same way we can understand genetic risk. We can start to understand what your exposome, what like your lifestyle and your diet are doing, which is cool.
So let's get into the weeds with it a little bit in terms of like the kinds of foods that we eat and the kinds of ingredients that might be harmful to our microbiome, and maybe even some of the additives in the food. So let's just start with the big one, ultra processed food.
Right. So ultra processed foods, there's lots of, unfortunately, like the science is there in terms of epidemiological evidence, but there hasn't been that many trials, like randomized control trials, like Kevin Hall famously did his. But there's so much resistance from the food industry.
Really? Is that the reason that there's no trials going on?
No. I think the reason there isn't trials going on is because it's not being funded. I think it will be now. There's lots of recommendations for more funding for ultra-processed food research. But I think that it's a bit, smoking is a good comparison. There was so much epidemiological data. It was like, we think smoking is doing this thing. We think smoking, and everyone's like, nah. Like the cigarette industry were like, no, like why? Like we're not sure. It could be something else, right? It's not the smoking. It's not the actual cigarettes. Something else. And this is what's happening. It's what we're seeing with ultra processed foods. It's like, but it's not the actual processing. We think, is it just because they're high in fat and salt and sugar? Like, and there's been work done to show how many like high fat, salt, sugar foods are also ultra processed foods. And like a lot of them are, but not all of them. And so classic example is like diet soda. It's not high fat, salt or sugar, it is an ultra processed food,
Right.
it's definitely not good for you.
Yeah.
But they're like, well, but we don't know if it's the processing. So anyway, we're in this phase now where the epidemiological evidence is so strong that I think it would be, and I have some, I'm very unpopular with a lot of people for saying this, by the way. Like, it would be very short-sighted to say that ultra-processed foods are not having a negative health impact. They clearly are. So we can look at it by seeing how they've become so commonplace in the food environment. You can look, and the epidemiological data we have is like the more of it you eat, the worse your health outcomes associated, like the worse association you have. So, so it's all pointing in the same direction. There is some nuance, which is where I think recognizing that the NOVA classification was created for research. Amazing classification, works very well in research, but it's not really designed for consumer use. Like, it's hard for someone to navigate NOVA 4 classification to make their shopping easier. So that's where more consumer focused tool, and this is something we're working on at Zoe, to actually help people know, like, okay, of the NOVA 4 foods, so of the ultra processed foods, should I be as worried about granary bread from the supermarket as I am about the Twinkies?
Yeah, and just to explain what the NOVA classification is.
Yeah,
Can you
so,
go ahead and do that?
Yeah, of course. The NOVA classification is this like way of grouping foods according to how processed they are.
Okay.
So starting from like the whole food. So this is like your corn on the cob, the actual corn on the cob. And then you move up to the corn on the cob has been like taken off the cob and tinned. And that's a processed food. And that's not a problem for health. Like that's not an issue. Then there's a different group for cooking oils and condiments like salt and pepper. Like, they don't seem to have a health impact. They're not negative. And like in their processing, of course, too much salt is not great. And then the NOVA 4, like NOVA 4 is this ultra processed food category. So if we take the corn example, so you've gone from like corn on the cob, corn in a tin, and then Doritos, which are corn tortilla chips, but like, where's the corn? And it's no shade on like the brand, by the way. It's just, it's been ultra processed to be a crunchy triangle with colors and flavors, and
they taste so good.
It tastes so good. Like, I like the Cool
that?
Ranch. What is it? Cool? The
Cool
Cool one?
Ranch, yeah.
Yeah,
Cool
they're
Ranch.
good.
So certainly there's, that impact of it's addictive because it's so tasty.
Yeah.
And it's not filling, so we need to eat more.
Right.
And maybe that's why it's made the way it's made, is so that you pay more because you're having to eat more.
Right. So,
but more on, I'm more interested personally on a more microbiome level or a cellular level as to what is exactly going on here.
And that's where the industry is like, we don't have the evidence to say exactly which mechanisms have like been affected. So exactly what you just said, we know that they're hyperpalatable. And listen, it's not a mistake that they're hyperpalatable. The food industry spends tons of money on researching, like, is that Cocoa Pop tastier or is that Cocoa Pop? And they do user research and see which one gets eaten more of. So which one do people eat more of, which means they'll finish a pack earlier, which means they'll buy more. And they do satiety. Like, it's a science. It's food science. So they are formulated in that way. But when we look at their health effects, so Kevin Hall study is like the best we have for understanding how much more people eat when they're given this food, and then what happens to their like biometrics basically and blood tests. But when we think about the gut microbiome, so when you're eating, let's use corn. I like it. So when you're eating the corn, if you're having corn on the cob or like the tinned corn or even popcorn, right, which is high in fiber actually, so great. You eat the food and you're getting fiber, you're getting polyphenols. It's actually quite hard. So the texture means that you're going to chew and swallow, and it's going to take some time to empty from your stomach into your small intestine. And actually when it gets to the small intestine, because the fiber is so hard, you're only going to extract a fraction of the sugars and basically the nutrients, because it's the food matrix impacts, which is like the structure of the food, impacts how much you're able to absorb, right? And then the fiber gets to your gut microbiome in the large intestine, and there they have a party. They're like, yeah, especially corn, like so fibrous. So they're breaking the fibers down. And this is like going back to like, how does this impact the brain? When the fibers are broken down, the microbes that like corn fiber, because microbes like different things, they're very picky. They will only eat the thing they like. So you have your like corn loving microbes. They're breaking the fiber down and they're making byproducts, microbiome, micro poop.
Yeah.
They're called postbiotics, right? And you can buy them as supplements now. But essentially, those postbiotics then have an effect, not only on the actual gut cells, so the lining of our gut is 1 cell thick, it's super fragile, not only on that, but also they result in signaling molecules that go up the vagus nerve to the brain directly and go into the bloodstream and impact the brain indirectly. Now, if these are short-chain fatty acids, they actually help to feed the cells in the gut to make sure they're creating enough mucin, which is like the snot layer of your gut. It's so sexy, this whole topic. But it protects your gut barrier. Like your gut barrier is 1 cell thick. Yeah. And right on the other side of it is a ton of immune system cells waiting for information. So the mucin layer is super important. It needs to be thick. It needs to be hard to cross. Because if you start getting like waste products from basically your gut leaking into like the outside where the immune system's like, what is this? Get inflammation. Inflammation is a normal response to something that's not supposed to be there. And when there's inflammation, of course, it changes the whole ecosystem. And the more inflammation you have, it like self-propagates if it doesn't repair. And we know this from like really extreme cases of severe malnutrition in children. It's actually where a lot of this science has come from, because when you look at which children survive and which don't, often the children that have the most damage to the gut are the ones that don't survive, because the immune system is so dependent on the gut. So you've had this corn, this has all happened, magical. You're also quite satiated, but actually it's a high volume, low calorie density food because you haven't been able to absorb that much energy from it. So you've eaten this and you've got just what you need from it. Your microbiome is happy. And you're also going to go to the loo like more efficiently because you have enough fiber, your microbiome is working, the mucin is there, it's all moving along nicely. And in that poo, you're getting rid of like quite a lot of microbes, but you're also getting rid of all the hormones you don't need anymore. You're getting rid of any kind of the toxins that come from the liver, from cellular processes across the body. They're all being excreted. And it seems obvious, but it's worth saying that if you're constipated, you're not going to loo regularly, those things aren't being excreted. And they actually can get back in, because especially if you have an inflamed gut, it's permeable. So the things that you're trying to get rid of are coming back in, right? So that's with the corn or your sweet corn.
So would you recommend not holding it in?
100%, yeah. Go to the loo.
I've heard her say that before, so I just wanted her to say that.
What, not holding your poo?
Yeah, not holding your poo, or not holding your farts or something like that.
Oh, right, yeah. Right? I mean, that's also, there was an influencer recently, a Carnivore Diet influencer, who was like, I haven't farted in 3 years. And I was like, oh my Lord, that is not a good sign. So, yeah, please, yeah. Of course, flatulence can be problematic if you have bowel conditions, but there's a normal level of flatulence which is like human, and everyone needs to just get on board with it. Now let's eat a Dorito now. Okay, Cool Ranch. Tastes great. I've eaten like half a pack because it's so easy. Okay, I'm not full, by the way. I've eaten half a pack, but I'm not full because there's no food matrix. The minute I chew it, it's basically a smush. Most of it is absorbed in my small intestine. All the sugars are absorbed. All the fats that are not a healthy fat profile are absorbed. And actually the colors and the flavorings and the emulsifiers that make them taste weirdly creamy when you eat them, they've made their way down to the gut microbiome, but there's no fiber has made its way down. So the gut microbes are like, oh, okay, we've got some leftover bad fats, maybe something like a little bit of the smush that wasn't absorbed at the small intestine level. And then we have these new xenobiotics. We've got these chemicals that we did not evolve with. And the gut microbiome is like, what's that? Can I break it down? And so the science on this is fairly new, but the trials that have been done on it's essentially feeding people high emulsifier diets clearly show that there's an increased inflammation in the gut. So much so that now the recommendations for people with irritable bowel diseases like Crohn's is to reduce ultra-processed foods because emulsifiers make it worse.
And when you say inflammation in the gut, you mean that process of, that mucin not being intact.
Yeah.
Those
gaps.
foreign bodies getting into the into the circulation.
And specifically into the the immune system tissues that are just outside with loads of the immune system. The estimate is about 80% plus of the immune system is lying just outside the gut. And that's because it's one of our biggest surfaces that come into contact with external things. It makes sense, right? So you have the immune system cells like congregate where there's a chance of break-in. And the gut is a huge one for this. So it's talking about that. It's like the inflammation that results from things that shouldn't be crossing. But it's also really uncomfortable. It's like, it's not that you have the inflammation and you don't notice. You have gut symptoms. And it's not just gut symptoms, of course. So if we look at the association between having Crohn's disease or irritable bowel syndrome and mental health, your mental health is much more likely to be worse when you have these inflammatory bowel conditions. So, and that just goes to show like the gut-brain axis is incredibly powerful. Now, I'm sure you guys know Professor John Crean. He's like he's the king of the gut-brain axis. And he's done amazing science that shows how the like postbiotics themselves and microbes travel to the brain and have an impact on mental health, have an impact on brain health, can actually impact the way that brain diseases maybe start or continue. So like Parkinson's has been really well researched for this. There's now some noise about Alzheimer's plaques, and are they actually an immune reaction to bacteria that have found their way? So there's that science is fascinating.
So that's what I was gonna ask. Is our gut microbiome crossing the blood-brain barrier?
Well, it depends which side of the fence you're on for the argument of like the blood-brain barrier being so impenetrable. I mean, from what I've seen, I think that we're moving away from the blood-brain barrier being like the Berlin Wall and you can't cross it. It's not that straightforward. Things do cross. And okay, so let's say that bacteria might be crossing, maybe, but certainly inflammatory cytokines are. They're small enough. So if you have like a high inflammation status in your gut, the inflammatory cytokines are crossing. And we see like a really beautiful way of thinking about this is with rheumatoid arthritis, right? Like one of the drugs that is most effective for rheumatoid arthritis is an antidepressant. It like So is it because it's an anti-inflammatory that is then reducing depression, and is that what's happening? So there's lots of ways that when inflammatory status is high, then you're much more likely to be depressed. And when that's brought down, you reverse that mental health condition. So it's really interesting. And we can do this like with diet, right? So if you then feed your microbes like less of the Doritos, more of the corn, you're helping your gut microbiome to maintain a healthy ecosystem in your gut. It's reducing the likelihood or the severity of inflammation in your gut. And that has a direct impact on your brain and your mental health. And mental health for me is like not so dichotomous. It's not brain health that's different. Like mental health is more. But it all works together. So what's really clear is like the ultra-processed food research. I mean, one of the biggest reviews was looking at consumption of ultra-processed foods and depression, and it made a huge splash in like the news, and everyone was like, oh my God, because it showed how the more ultra-processed foods you eat, and there was no nuance in this one. So in cardiovascular disease and diabetes, type 2 diabetes, there was some nuance where like some ultra-processed foods seem to be less bad. But with the depression one, that was like, nah. Like they're all, so the more you eat, the more likely you are to be depressed, to have depression. The more likely, and it's like, and if you're a child or a teen or an adolescent, it's even worse. And that's probably because we know that if you're diagnosed with a mental health condition before you're 24, like 75% of mental health diagnoses are first made before that age. So we know that a majority of adults who have mental health issues actually were first diagnosed as adolescents or children. And so then we look at, okay, this is all pointing in the same direction, and we have a mental health crisis on our hands. Is that surprising if we know that this is the food that especially children and young people are eating most of? So there's lots of studies looking at percentage of energy intake attributable to ultra-processed foods. Everyone agrees that it's above 50%. But when we look at different age groups, it's like in toddlers, so like 2-year-olds, and in adolescents, it's like up to 72%.
Wow.
That's 72% of your energy intake is coming from these foods. And I'm all for finding the nuance. I'm all for finding ways to help people actually eat more baked beans because they're ultra processed foods, but they're beans, so we think they're probably good. Like if that's your ultra processed food, great. But whilst we can see this trend, wouldn't it just be better to say, like, we just need to reduce that percentage? I don't care how you do it. But like when we look to countries that have a lower percentage intake, so Italy, Romania, they're like below 15%. They're like 10%, 12% of their calorie intake is ultra processed
So what are
foods.
the toddlers and adolescents eating?
Well, the food environment is completely different. So they don't have like when you go to a supermarket or a store here or in the UK, it's like shelves and shelves of only ultra processed foods. There's 70% of food manufacturing companies make only ultra processed foods, like no healthy food,
Right.
like zero.
Yeah.
So it's the food environment that we live in means that children, like I work with parents, I do work with families quite a lot. And it's not unusual for a baby to be weaned on pouches and melty puffy sticks and, you know, like all these foods that did not exist 10 years ago. And the way that, like, I find that this is the worst bit, is the way that the ultra processed foods for children are marketed. It's like ideal for self-feeding, ideal for finger food. It's like such a rude way to market,
to prey
on parents, because parents are always trying to do the best for their kids. So when you're marketing veggie straws to me and they contain kale and they're safe because there's a hole in the middle, so it reduces choking risk, I'm like, oh my God, maybe that's a good idea, because actually I don't want my kid to choke, obviously. And so then we're like faced with this problem of, I remember I was in this restaurant once and I was just observing, there was a young family with a baby on a high chair, and she must have been 8 or 9 months old. I love that age. It's like they'll eat anything at that age, right? And she was trying to grab her mother's scrambled eggs from the plate. She had like scrambled eggs and avo, and this baby was like going for it. And she like was like, no, and got out a pouch.
Now don't eat this whole food.
You know, it like very likely was like, well, this is safer and it's neater and it's tidier and it's easier. It's not the parent, right? It's the way these are marketed. And then, so we now live in a world where children they're born, okay, so like if we're thinking, just looking at it from a gut microbiome perspective. So the science we have today, and I'd love to do more on like children's gut microbiome composition, but the science we have today, it suggests that the stable microbiome signature starts at like 3. So it's pretty young, right? First 3 years of life. It's where you have the most flux of gut microbiome composition. It's where you have the most potential to like step in and do something.
Also the most brain development.
And the most brain development, exactly, right? So children are born by cesarean section. That's the first hurdle. It's like, okay, you've just changed the gut microbiome signatures that are going to enter this child. Now, I just want to preface this by saying that I've had 2 children, one by cesarean and one by vaginal delivery. Not through choice, like I had to deliver the second one through cesarean. So I've been there, so like no judgment, but that child has a different microbiome signature because the first microbes it comes into contact with are not from the mother. They're like the surgeon's skin and the environment. And let's be honest, like in an operating theatre, it's the plastics, the like all the what's in the air essentially. Right. And then skin to skin contact, and then breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is like a magical potion for the gut microbiome.
The best diet ever.
It literally, literally. It is not for adults. Like, let's just be clear. I know that you guys in the States have this sudden love for bovine colostrum, which is mind-blowing. It's not meant for adults. Like, right. And but, you know, colostrum in the first few days is almost exclusively immune system cells and microbes for the gut microbiome to form. Then you have breast milk itself, human milk oligosaccharides, enzymes. Like there is thousands of components to human breast milk, most of which we're just starting to really understand, all of which is geared towards the gut microbiome, including increasing the efficiency of the gut microbiome to break down breast milk into different energy and vitamins. And it's amazing. It's like, it's a fascinating science. Most children are not breastfed now. right? If anything, they might be breastfed for like 3 weeks and then they move on to formula milk. Now, at the risk of like getting sued, formula milk is the first ultra processed food that you can consume.
Mm-hmm.
It is hydrolyzed like cow's milk with additives, sweeteners, emulsifier. Like it's the full gambit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, it is necessary. It saves lives. Some children absolutely need it. So it's not about not having it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But, my challenge is, what if we had human donor breast milk as an option?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be good?
Yeah.
Right.
And some countries do. Brazil has an excellent human donor breast milk, like state-run and funded network.
Wow.
So children who can't access their mother's breast milk for whatever reason can access human milk,
Yeah.
which is, everyone's like, oh, it sounds novel, but isn't that more obvious than cow's milk in a powder?
Yeah.
So that would take years to do, but there's something to think about there. And I think we're really doing mothers an injustice in the lack of support, education that we give mothers. Because let me tell you, breastfeeding is a full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
For the first few weeks, you do it for about 8 hours a day. Seriously.
Yeah.
So just giving people that knowledge, but then giving them the power to choose.
Yeah.
Because informed choice is not informed choice if all you're seeing is adverts for formula milk and then no education on what breast milk does.
Yeah. My wife's a pediatrician. One of her best referrals is a breastfeeding therapist who comes to the home and works on all the tactics. Because everybody, even people who know how to do it or had a kid and knew how to do it, the second time, third time around, it's still different. And you need that help to actually do it right and have it be comfortable enough to do 8 hours.
To crack on, exactly. And so if we look at countries that have really high breastfeeding rates, like Kenya, they have like 96%. It's insane.
Wow.
Like 96% breastfeeding to 6 months.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
But they have a culture where your mom, your auntie, your grandma is helping you to learn how to breastfeed.
Right.
We don't do that here, obviously.
Yeah.
And so we need to create that somehow. Family units aren't close like that now. So like, how do we help people do that? So this child's had, to this point, if they've been born by a cesarean section and then they are formula fed from birth, you can see how their exposure to helpful microbes and helpful prebiotics, so like the food that microbes need, has been reduced. So when you look at children that have this path and you compare their gut microbiome composition to vaginally delivered breastfed infants, their bifidobacteria is like a fraction. And the bifidobacteria is infantis is the most important strain in children. And so that's already a gap. Now, we know that the child with the less bifidobacteria expression in that path has an increased risk of allergies, eczema, asthma. That's because of the immune system. So immune system at this time, babies are born basically without one, as we know. And so this is when the immune system is forming and understanding and learning. I did a talk recently with a very famous allergist, and it was interesting to hear that genetics plays actually quite a big part in allergy, but this immune system formation is important. And then now we also have a trend of like washing our babies really young, and so disrupting the skin barrier. And when the skin barrier immune system is exposed to food, so maybe you're using like an oat cream, or like for a very long time, children with eczema were prescribed peanut oil-based cream.
Wow.
Guess what happens? The immune system's like, hang on, why is there peanut here?
Right.
That
Peanut
means that
allergy.
it's not supposed to be here because we didn't see it in the gut. So what is it doing?
Wow.
So it's really like this stuff it has an impact, right?
It's scary.
Well, I guess it can be. It's all like marginal risk. It doesn't mean you're definitely going to have this. So like, for example, my second girl who was born this like through cesarean, she doesn't have allergies. It's great. But so it doesn't mean it's definitely going to happen. But we just have to, if we look at the life course, it's like mode of delivery at birth, breastfeeding versus formula feeding, and then weaning. Yeah. This is a key time for the gut microbiome to compose itself, for the immune system to practice and know what's going on, and at the same time the brain's growing. And so you can see how this would be like an impactful time.
Yeah. The golden window.
The golden window of opportunity, first 1,000 days. And why we have like DOHAD as a whole discipline, developmental origins of health and disease. Like, why is this time from conception to second birthday so critical? Because so much is happening, and then you can do things later in life, but that's not going to change the early exposure. So it's like when we look at that, I think we have to understand that then children we have to like help our kids to get as much of the good exposure as we can. And as I said, not everyone chooses how they deliver. Not everyone chooses if they can breastfeed or not. So I understand that. And there's some cool companies doing work around creating like probiotics for these children specifically and testing that they work. But then, weaning is something that most of us can impact. Yep. So let's go there. And let's understand that the food industry has created a whole market that didn't exist 10 years ago, didn't exist. Like even 7 years ago, it was not that big. We've gone from just having like the Dr. Gerber pots to having dozens of different products that aren't food. Right. They're like, they're made with foods, but often they're like boiled, then pureed so finely. So there's no food matrix. The fiber content is down. There's more water and more sugar. And the nutrient profile is not that good either. Like doesn't have as many of the micronutrients in it. And so, but it's marketed as safe. It's marketed as suitable for your child's age. And so it's convenient. It's like in packets that you can just open. But it's really sad to think that children are going to be like more used to opening packets than they are like peeling an orange or a banana or something. So I think it's clear that we need to empower parents to cook again and give them whole foods. And even if it's not cooking, it doesn't have to be complicated. Like sometimes you do see influencers who make star-shaped pancakes or like it doesn't have to be that at all, right? If you can do that, amazing, good, but it doesn't have to be that. But then we come into the problem of like people don't know how to cook because we don't teach it anymore. And some people don't have kitchens. Right? I've met people, especially when I lived in New York, that they use their ovens to store shoes and stuff. Like, so cooking culture is gone, right? Yeah. And we need to sort of, I think for me, understanding that investing in cooking as a skill is actually a really important life skill. It's not like a nice to have. You know, a nice to have is speaking French, or like a nice to have is piano lessons. But cooking is pretty fundamental.
Like driving a car. Like, you got to learn how to drive a car.
If you live in LA, yes.
Right. If you live in LA, you got to learn how to drive a car.
Yeah.
And maybe it should just be integrated just from that standpoint, right?
And it used to be. So, like, home economics used to be a thing.
That's right.
And then when that got taken off, which was, 50-ish years ago? You can see the correlation between in-home cooking from when that went. Like, just... people just... Because it's not obvious and people don't have time to or don't necessarily are inclined to teach their kids how to cook. So then it's actually a life skill that we've removed from the curriculum, and now
there are easier options.
There are much easier options that are packaged beautifully in bright colored packaging with your favorite cartoon character on the front, and they taste really good and really sweet. There's so much sugar in them. And so it's like, okay, well, so we need to start somewhere. And I think weaning for me is the obvious place for two reasons. Because of the impact it has. So like, I think that's a nice driver. Parents are very engaged with this idea that they can have a real impact on health. But also because weaning is when children will, especially early stage, like 6 to 9 months or 12 months, they will eat anything. They're not picky. Like,
well, they certainly put anything in their mouth. So you can put sauerkraut in front of your child. Natural yogurt, don't give them flavored yogurt. They're never going to go back to the natural yogurt if you give them strawberry fandangled fromage frais. Like, it's not going to happen. So you have this opportunity of exposing them to flavors early that they might not like, by the way, but they'll still try it and keep exposing them. Then they'll get their independence. They will start to show their own mind and preference, and that's okay. That's part of the process. But if you get in early, that's when parents are most scared of feeding kids food, is when they're most open to trying things. And if your child has been formula fed, they've had the same flavor every meal for 6 months.
So it's really important that you actually start varying, because of course breast milk changes. Breast milk changes flavor. If you eat curry spice, your breast milk will taste of curry spice. So children who are breastfed tend to have more variation in the exposures of taste. And so especially if your child is formula fed, like that window of introducing bitter foods is really important. And so I think, and to like go back to brain health, we know at this age, omega-3 and iron are critical for brain development. And your infant formula does contain iron, so that's good. But if your child has been breastfed, so the way that iron is bound in breast milk is highly available. So it's a bit of a myth that children who are breastfed don't have a good iron status. If the mother has good iron status, the lactoferrin is highly bioavailable, so it's fine. It's about the mother's health. But they still need to have high iron foods when they wean, because the formula milk does have more iron in it. So in a way, like, that's more protective for that. But it's iron-rich foods. Yes, it does mean that your children can have meat and fish, shrimp, like salmon, red meat, but not too much as well. Like, I've seen a trend recently, which is quite worrying, of carnivore babies. What? And, you know, what we do know is that children who have a high consumption of animal protein in early childhood have an increased risk of obesity as adults. So, and what we do know is that your gut microbes don't love that at all. Like, they still need the fiber. So whilst it's good for iron, I think variety is key, introducing to a variety of foods. And the pulses and lentils, nuts and seeds, they contain iron too. So like, just don't go too hard on that, I guess. But yeah, so then, and I think if people engage with that for the first like 3 to 4 years, it's a really good foundation. And then unfortunately, like when they're going to school, you have less control. And a lot of parents are very worried about this, and I get a lot of questions about, what do I do? Like, my child's school food is terrible. How can I? And often, you know, being a working parent is super hard. So often the children have to go to breakfast club as well, and then perhaps they're doing like the wraparound childcare later into the day. So sometimes nearly all of their meals in the week are outside of the home. And I think here it's like consistency at home can have a really big impact, especially when they're younger. So before they sort of turn 11, 12, the food environment at home is something that we can control, and to varying degrees depending on your income. So like, but everyone has some agency over their own food environment in the home. So I think here sometimes we have to be, this is where like the emotional ties to food come in, because some people love to have treats in the home, and they'll have like a treat drawer or like the cookie jar. And that's really it's more of an emotional and cultural thing. Right. And it's actually saying, but can you change that for your child? Because the food environment outside of the home is such now that it's really hard to make good choices. So, you know, if you've inherited the cookie jar from your grandma, her food environment outside the home was pretty sparse. And the cookie jar at home was like a winning thing, but we're not there anymore. So we need to sort of remove ourselves from that mentality and understand that if we create a food environment where children are able to access fresh fruits, nuts and seeds, plain yogurt, like nut butters if they're not allergic, of course, eggs, vegetables, that becomes normal for them in the home. And so, you know, sometimes I did a podcast recently, and actually this parent commented, being like, when I talked about exposure to foods and making sure that we're serving, as parents, our job is to serve healthy foods and then let the child make the choice. You can't force children to eat, and we shouldn't. But if that's what's available, whenever they do choose to eat, that's what's going to be there. And the one person commented like, well, no, my child is just not going to eat, and then they'll go to the snack drawer and eat chocolate. I'm like, but so remove that, right? And I kind of, I don't always respond, but I was like, you pointed at the problem. You pointed to the problem. And it's often like, children aren't stupid. Like if they know that there's a snack drawer with biscuits and chocolate, and of course they can make that choice. But if the choice is different, that's what they know. So like what they know is what you expose them to. Then adolescence is like slightly trickier, of course, because they have more agency to go and eat out of home.
Yeah.
But again, if they've had a good foundation and they enjoy foods at home when they're young, by the time they get to out of home purchase, and sure, they might go to McDonald's, or they might like buy a donut on the way into school, or like that's part of it. But you can still keep the consistent food environment in the home. And actually, children who make healthier food choices early in childhood are more likely to make those food choices out of home. So it does work. Like it does help.
Yeah.
And at the same time, applying where you can, speaking to the teachers, speaking to like the principals, having a conversation and trying to change how schools view food as well. Maybe even if it's something as simple as like, can we allow our children to bring in fruit snacks instead of having like cookies or something? Like sometimes it's changes that the parents can implement without the school needing to invest, because often that's the problem. And engaging with that actual conversation can be sometimes doesn't help, but sometimes it does. So yeah, I think it's a lot, because we're having to, at the moment, and I think it will change, but at the moment parents are having to work against the food environment to provide healthy food for their kids. But I think that will pivot.
Yeah, what do you think? I think a important distinction that you've made before, and something that I was pretty surprised by, because it seems like the words are used interchangeably, is ultra processed versus processed. Right. And I think you mentioned it before in the NOVA classification. But can you please expand on that a little bit to give us a better understanding? Yeah.
So it's going back to our corn, right? So the processing that takes place to take the kernels off the cob and like boil them up and put them in a tin, that's a process, and it's industrial. It happens in factories. But the end product is the kernels of the cob in a tin, maybe with some brine, or sometimes not, sometimes just water, and that's it. So when you eat them, the food matrix hasn't been altered. Like they've been taken off the cob, but the actual kernels are intact. They've been boiled and maybe salted, but they haven't had any emulsifiers put in. There's no sweeteners. There's no artificial colorings or flavorings. So what really differentiates processed foods is actually being just foods that are made easier to consume and that can be stored for longer, because your tinned corn is going to last months, but your fresh corn, you got to eat it, otherwise it'll go moldy. So those foods aren't a problem. And it's important that we make that clear, because for a lot of people, when I say like eat more fruits and vegetables, they're expensive, but frozen fruits aren't. Frozen berries are a fraction of the cost of a fresh berry. So, and that's processing, freezing something. So processing to preserve, essentially, is not problematic. And the key differentiator is that it still looks like the food that it is. So like a frozen spinach or a frozen berry still looks like a berry or a spinach leaf. They don't have the industrial additives, which we sometimes call them cosmetic additives, because they don't do anything good. They're just there to like make it look better or taste sweeter. And they're not sold. And they're not processed to make them hyperpalatable. So they're not processed to like make them quicker and easier to eat. And those foods, and they are used interchangeably, and it's not useful actually, because you don't want people to be scared of tinned food or like dried whole grains,
or anything frozen,
or anything frozen.
Foods,
The frozen food aisle is really useful.
It's a reasonable solution, especially for people that they can't buy produce because it goes bad too quick, and they need something a little bit more sustainable when they're having to feed a family, or even from like a high level public health view. Right. 100%. When we're thinking about how do we create any sort of public health change in regards to avoiding ultra processed foods, I think processed foods are pretty reasonable.
Part of the answer. So it reduces food waste as well. Because as you said, like if you're eating your corn, you will eat what you need from the tin corn, and you're not throwing away the fresh stuff that you didn't eat. Or I mean raspberries, how quickly do they go off? I don't buy them fresh anymore, because I'm like next day they're furry. I'm like, why? So and actually, if you want to eat organic food, frozen organic is so much more affordable, right? And in terms of nutrient profile, often the frozen foods retain their polyphenol and vitamin content better because freezing helps that process. So if you have a berry that's like traveled 1,000 miles and then been in a van, and then like the polyphenols and vitamins are quite fragile, so they start to degrade pretty quickly. And frozen foods are often frozen on the field. So you actually have like more punch in them.
Baked and frozen.
Yeah.
All right, so the podcast is brought to you by Contact Medical Services. This service puts you in touch with a verified concussion physician specialist within 24 hours of you having your injury. This is virtually unheard of anywhere in the country, and there's good reason for it. It's because our current healthcare system doesn't allow us to get to the specialists we need to get to in a timely manner. And when you're talking about brain injury, that's particularly important. A service like this could prevent the consequences of having a concussion, such as persistent cognitive and memory issues, headaches, psychological issues. So we're proud that they're sponsoring the podcast. We'll put their website at the bottom in the YouTube description. Please check them out. And let's keep going with the episode.
The perception, though, as you're walking through the freezer aisle,
Yeah.
is that you're not doing right by whoever's in the home that you're feeding these frozen foods to. Going to the
Fresh food
vegetable
aisle.
and fresh
Yeah.
food aisle, you feel a little bit more like
Yeah.
you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And like it's interesting because we can change like that's so I would never buy I don't buy fresh spinach because there's just no real reason for me to do that. I in the way that I cook it. So like, and frozen spinach is always in my freezer. I get it out when I need it and I cook with it.
Yeah.
Or even I don't buy fresh raspberries. Berries are like so when blueberries are in season, I do because they're delicious. But otherwise they're frozen, and like I never buy strawberries in December. No, like
Where
they
is it
taste
coming
awful.
from?
They're coming usually they're coming from like North Africa. By the time they get to the UK, they taste of absolutely nothing. I'm much better off. I usually just eat strawberries in spring, like when they're in season. We grow them in the UK, so like it's also just better. And if not, I buy them frozen. And so I think we just need to sort of think about it differently. Some foods do work better fresh. So if you're having a salad, you can't really make frozen salad. But where it's like where it makes sense to do it, or where it's more affordable for you to then eat whole foods, it makes so much sense to do. And we should remove that barrier. But also it would be cool if the supermarkets and this actually made frozen food look good, because it's also partly psychological. We know the positioning of food aisles, it changes perception and value cost. So when you look at it's like a whole science, right, where you place foods. End of aisle promotions always do really well. The like outskirt are the ones where people will usually walk down. So often the frozen whole foods are like in the middle at the bottom, opposite the lentils that are looking at you like, buy me. So it's also just looking past that and realizing that like big spinach isn't trying to get you to buy more frozen spinach, and like the lentil and whole grain companies don't have the advertising budgets of some of the other companies that are putting end of aisle product promotions.
What about dairy? I think there's been a growing fear around it, especially with vegan and vegetarian diets and styles becoming more prevalent, and lactose intolerance becoming more accepted or
understood. Yeah. So there's two things to think about with dairy. One is the ethical and environmental impact, and they kind of go hand in hand for me. Although some people don't care about the ethical, so it depends how much you care about animals, I guess. So ethically and environmentally, dairy is hard to defend because when you see how dairy cows are treated, hard, right? Yeah. You just impregnate them, they give birth, you remove the calf, you like milk them dry, and then you re-impregnate them, and that's their life, basically. Now, there are, of course, like more ethical dairy farmers, and if you're lucky enough to live on a farm and have your own cows, then that's not happening, but people don't do that. So I'm talking about like the, commercial. Now, in terms, so that's, and environmentally, we know that cattle farming is like the most impactful for global warming and for just deforestation because of what the cows need to eat. Yeah. So that's one argument and one thing which in my personal life has meant that I reduce the amount of dairy I buy. So I don't really use dairy milk. But the health impact, like the beneficial health effects of yogurt and kefir and the deliciousness of Parmesan means that, you know, and nutritionally they're very good. So when we look at yogurt and kefir especially, so going back to milk, the health impacts of milk aren't that great. When we look at the data, there was a really beautiful paper in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition that looked at the pathways for basically inflammation with dairy milk, and it's really interesting. Like people, I think drinking a lot of dairy milk isn't thought to be very good. So nations that have high dairy milk consumption tend to have taller children, taller adults, but they also have like more hip fractures. So it's almost this artificial growth that you see because the dairy milk contains the hormones and peptides to help the calf grow, and it's a bit more than we need as humans. So there's interesting science around that. Never given my kids dairy milk. They never drank it, and they don't like it. They would never have it now. But for milk, for dairy, for like yogurt and kefir, it's really good for us. It's got the probiotic strains that are used to actually make it. And Sonnenberg's lab have like done lovely trials to show how eating these fermented foods like kefir and yogurt and natural yogurt really help to improve the inflammation that we were talking about earlier. So like they reduce unwanted inflammation markers. So it's like, and also they're very nutrient dense. So you get vitamin D, you get like nice vitamin composition, as well as good protein, and like the fat profile seems to be healthy. So even though it's technically saturated fats, but it seems to work for humans do well. And if you are lactose intolerant, like a proper kefir is very low in lactose because the fermentation process removes it. And same with like natural yogurt, they're fairly low in lactose. Fermented cheeses like Parmesan, like have basically no lactose and very high in calcium. So for me, it's like, is dairy necessary? No, you don't have to eat it, but the dairy foods can form part of a healthy diet and they have their own benefits. Should we be creating as much dairy as we are? Probably not. So so much milk gets thrown away every year, which is so sad. And could we maybe look at making it a bit more ethical? Then for sure, that'd be really nice. But I think there's no need to be scared of milk or fear like dairy products unless you're allergic to lactose, and in which case like people take Lactaid, don't they? Like you can do that, but it seems a bit unnecessary. And there is also the downside to like highly processed cheeses definitely have like an unhealthy fatty acid profile and don't help anything. They have they're not fermented. So it's
what does a highly processed cheese look like?
Like, it's cheese slices.
String cheese.
String cheese, and it's the same with yogurt. So quality of food is a bit of a theme because you can have good quality dairy and it's got beneficial health impacts, or you can have poor quality and it's either like a very sugary, highly flavored, highly colored yogurt that doesn't have any live strains, for example, or like a string cheese, which so quality is important, and it's important in dairy, but it's important in all food, really.
What's your opinion on saturated fats? I think it used to be demonized. Now I think that's changing a little bit. You mentioned it. You mentioned it just now in relation to dairy. But what is your opinion on that?
Well, we know that high saturated fat diets aren't good for heart health. I don't think there's any controversy there. I think where we went wrong was with the low fat movement. So this idea that creating low fat products of high fat foods was better. It's not. But I think that's a theme there. So it's like in the same way that having low sugar products of cakes, like low sugar cakes don't make sense and they're not going to be better for you. Okay. And so it's Diet Coke, not better for you. Like it's better for you for your teeth probably. But overall, if you're drinking that every single day, it's not going to be good for you. Low fat movement, same thing. Like you make low fat products or no fat products, but what are you doing to them? What are you doing to a no fat cheese to make it creamy? So it goes back to the ultra processed food thing, where it's like the manipulation of food to make it seem something it's not. doesn't tend to end well. So for me, I think the low-fat movement, and also low-fat products often were high in sugar. So that's been conflated with the saturated fat science. So there's no question that monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats are better for human health from nuts and seeds, olive oil, like that, the oily fish. That's what we should be eating more of. And I think with the low fat movement, people were avoiding nuts. They were avoiding avocados. That's where it was not helpful. But now it's gone too far where people are like, we should be eating sticks of butter. It's like, no, we definitely shouldn't be doing that. Like, that's not the answer. So it's about, it's that whole like swing thing, right? It's like we went low fat, people were like not eating nuts. And there's so much evidence to show that eating nuts every day like reduces your risk of overall death by like 20%. It's nuts, right? There you go.
Good one.
Nice one.
So and we've gone from avoiding these foods which are really clearly healthy to now going whoa all the other way to like what we should be eating is fatty bacon with a stick of butter with like marbled red meat at every meal. It's like no, too far. Like let's just go back to having a high fat diet from the healthy fats can actually be a good dietary approach for some people, but it's not a high saturated fat diet. That's not what that is. That's no. Yeah.
What does that look like?
What the high fat healthy diet?
Right.
So it's like when you're having avocados and nuts and you're eating oily fish and you're using extra virgin olive oil like throughout the day. It's, you know, when you eat that way, you do end up eating quite a lot of fat. And it's good health outcomes. So the PREDIMED study is probably the most famous for this. The trial where they did a standard diet, then Mediterranean diet plus extra nuts, and Mediterranean diet plus more extra virgin olive oil. So both of the intervention arms were high fat diets. Now the study became famous because they had to interrupt it because it was deemed unethical to continue, because the control arm were like dying way more than, or having heart attacks. It was actually heart disease was the outcome. And so they had to interrupt the trial. Now in that trial, the extra virgin olive oil arm did better than the extra nut arm. So this was, again, one of the pivotal trials where we saw that extra virgin olive oil had a especially good impact on health. And the extra virgin olive oil and the nut arms were matched for fat content. So both high fat diets, both good health outcomes, but extra virgin olive oil just took the prize for best. So in some cases, a Mediterranean dietary pattern is pretty high fat. It's not low fat at all, but it's not high fat from red meat or butter. So that's what the differentiator is.
What about cholesterol? How does cholesterol fit into everything?
Like dietary cholesterol?
Yeah.
So we know that dietary cholesterol intake doesn't directly impact blood cholesterol levels. So this like myth of eating, if you eat eggs, you get high cholesterol.
Right.
It doesn't track unless you eat 12 eggs a day, then. But too much of anything is not a good plan.
Exactly. I think that's the
we
point,
do have we have an influencer, I won't name him, but he's like the egg guy.
The egg guy?
He eats like 8 eggs a day. And he's like, eggs are the best food. Eat an egg, eat eggs. And it's like, okay, eggs are great. I actually did a research paper on eggs as an intervention for children in Nepal to like transform their dietary quality. And when you look at MDD, so when you look at public health nutrition, and one of the ways we measure whether children are having an adequate diet is to look at a minimum dietary diversity. An egg is its own thing by itself. So eggs are cool. They're nature's micronutrient. They have everything apart from vitamin C in them in some amount, right? But not too much. But dietary cholesterol, so like shrimp, eggs, we don't like, it's not too much of an issue. It depends what the food is. So again, if you're having eggs or shrimp, there's other parts to that are good for you, right? So iron, you're getting some omega-3 in the shrimp. But if you're getting your cholesterol levels up by eating fatty red meat, it has other things that are harmful for you. So it's again like what's the quality, what's the food? Because there's a difference between getting like the majority of your cholesterol from seafood and eggs and getting it all from processed meat or red meat.
So that's interesting, the processed meat piece, because I think processed meat was found to be a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease.
Really.
But
interesting.
On the back end of that, unprocessed meat has actually been shown to be potentially protective.
Yes.
So how do we
Yeah.
How do we differentiate between processed and unprocessed meat?
So yeah, and processed meat, like I think it's always worth mentioning that there's only a handful of things that we eat that are considered class 1 carcinogens. So like definitely cause cancer if you have too much, right? So obviously smoking, alcohol, which we can get to later, especially with brain health, right? And processed meat. And then betel nut and Chinese saltfish, which are really not consumed like that commonly. So processed meat is anything that's a meat product that's gone through several manipulations to get to the final thing. Now, it's really tricky when we talk about processed meat. People are like, well, what about, jamon from Spain, where it's like this one guy who cuts it and salts it. So there is, again, a bit of a scale there where if you're going to your butcher and he's mincing the meat in front of you and then he's putting it into a patty shape, is that a processed meat burger or is it just minced meat, right? So the critical thing is to look at what's been added to it. Again, a little bit like ultra-processed foods. If you're going to Italy and you're buying San Daniele ham, which is like from this one type of pig in the hills where they live outside and then they get cold and then it's like dried in the sunshine. It's wild when you look at how this stuff is made and then just salted. Yeah, like I wouldn't recommend eating it every day, but it's actually a very different product to your supermarket ham, which has got like 30% pork.
Oh my God.
And then it's like, what else is in there? And then sometimes on the label, it's like the marketing is like 70% pork, as though that's like a good thing. I'm like, okay, what's the rest? So look at the back of pack. It's surprising sometimes what you see. Sausages and like salamis and pastrami's and basically lunch meats rarely save themselves. They are a concoction of things always. So those foods, again, it's not, I don't think it's the meat necessarily in them that's doing majority of the harm. It's like what else is in there and as a cocktail. And they're not only carcinogens, they're also associated with, so Alzheimer's, I didn't know about it, but like they're also associated with like high blood pressure, increased risk of heart disease. So my thing is bacon's another one, and in the UK people love bacon. I mean, you guys love streaky bacon, which is so it's it's hard to say to people never eat it again because they're like no. but being aware that it's not something that is part, like it's not your healthy dietary pattern. So if we're aiming to eat well 80% of the time and then have 20% of the time for life to happen, that's like the goal, then your bacon is in that 20%. It shouldn't be, I've seen people recommend bacon for kids' breakfasts. Don't do that. Like, don't give them that from a young age. So, that's how I would look at that. And so it's interesting because the SMILES trial that Professor Felice Jacker did, so she's a nutritional psychiatrist. In her intervention arm, she had Mediterranean diet plus an extra serving of red meat. And it was because in this patient population, so in this trial, they had, very depressed, severe depression patients who had like drug resistant and treatment resistant. And she was like, let's just see if like changing their diets might help. And it took us so long to recruit because no psychiatrists, they were like, no, it's not going to do anything. Anyway, eventually she got enough patients recruited in and she did the trial, and a lot of these patients were B12 deficient. So she thought, well, let's just add like an extra portion of red meat, because in the Mediterranean dietary like pyramid, red meat is not that frequent. It's like maybe once every 10 days in their recommendations, right? So she upped that. And the trial results were so shocking and it was obviously blinded, that they reran the analysis like 3 times, because in these patients with severe depression, drug resistant, treatment resistant, like a lot of them were on meds as well, they saw a 30% reduction in severity score.
Wow.
Just with the dietary intervention.
Yeah, it's wild.
And the control group was increased social contact, which actually normally does quite well.
Right.
So that's why they were like rerunning it. They were like, surely it's a social contact, right?
Yeah.
And so that trial was really interesting because when you look at her adding in some extra red meat, like that did serve this population well. So there's I'm not anti-red meat. Like I personally don't eat red meat, but my dad passed away from colon cancer, and his granddad did, and I just know, like I can feel it when I eat red meat. it doesn't agree with me. Like I can just see my microbes creating like pro-inflammatory TMAO. I can just feel it. So for me, it doesn't work. My children have red meat. I buy really high quality red meat for them. And my husband, who's very glad that I do that because he loves it. And they eat it occasionally. Yeah. So I think that it's a very nutrient dense food that has highly available like iron and B12 and zinc. So I don't think that it's about demonizing red meat, but what's clear is that you don't need to have loads of it. Right. You don't need to eat it every day. Right. You don't need to eat it every week.
So then the carnivore diet, let's just like say what it is. Yeah. What do you think about that?
A lot of thoughts. I think it's a really dangerous trend. Yeah. So from the science we have, following a carnivore diet is directly putting people, especially long term. So always exceptions, ketogenic diets for certain health conditions, specifically for severe schizophrenia and for epilepsy.
You're talking about keto.
Yeah,
ketogenic.
Yeah, same. Yeah. It's like I feel like the carnivore diet is an offspring of
the ketogenic diet.
Can have beneficial impacts for health outcomes, but they're usually short-term interventions. It's not like eat like this for 5 years, right? Right. From what we know now, and listen, I'm really open to this changing. This I don't think it will. It might do a 180. In 15 years' time, we might look back and go, wow, carnivore diet was what we were looking for. I don't think so. But for now, if anyone starts following the carnivore diet, the evidence we have would suggest that they're increasing their risk of colorectal cancer, heart disease, and then less sort of severe, but still pretty not good, constipation, gut dysbiosis. And then, like, if we want to have a fifth point, terrible impact on the environment, right? Yeah, right? So I think what's happened here, like with any big like dietary change, which is really like massive, because the carnivore diet means that you cut out most of your diet. So any big restrictive diet, what often happens is that it makes people change their eating behaviors. Sounds obvious, but the key is the change in eating behaviors. It's not the carnivore. So if you change your eating behavior and start like the cabbage soup diet, terrible diet. But why did people do it? Because they changed their eating behaviors. They stopped eating ultra-processed foods. They stopped eating sugar. They stopped eating like junk foods. Often these diets also make you stop drinking alcohol. And so like they felt good for the first 2 weeks. They're like, I've lost weight and I'm like, I have more energy and my brain is clearer. And it's like, that's not because of the cabbage soup diet or it's not because of the carnivore diet, but it's because you've changed your dietary habits. And you've removed the things that weren't serving you and you're really thinking about what you're eating. But after the initial phase of like, woo, I feel great, like this is amazing, then you start to see, and it's interesting in the carnivore diet world, you see these things where like support groups almost, where it's like, okay, I haven't pooped for a week, like don't worry, I keep going up your fat and you'll get there. I was like, what? Like people, you can see people suffering with it. But then they all like, support each other and encourage. I mean, I made the mistake of posting a review, a meta-analysis that was published looking at red meat intake and HbA1c level, which massive meta-analysis clearly showed that excessive consumption of red meat actually negatively impacts HbA1c. It goes up. Wow. There's lots of reasons for this, lots of theories and things. Like one of them is the insulin sensitivity theory, where about 10% of adults are predicted to have an insulin response to protein. So everyone's like, well, if you eat protein, you don't get insulin. That's not true. Like, anyway, side note. But when I posted this, the comments, and I wasn't saying, don't do this. I was just saying, here's the paper. This is what it shows. So actually, if you're going to eat animal protein, you're best off eating oily fish as your primary source. Oh my Lord. I like opened a can of worms here and people are very, very emotive about it. So the carnivore diet for me is like one of these things that's really taken, people are very passionate, and I'm not denying that there might be a handful of people who truly thrive on this, by the way, because there's always people who are like unusual, but even the ones who have the most staunch carnivore people, eventually they're like, and I've decided to reintroduce diet, like fruit into my diet. and they give some reason, like they're going more paleo or whatever. And it's because really, truly, we didn't evolve to eat like that.
Right.
Yeah, I just wonder what we do with, all the anecdotal reports. All implies that they're overwhelming.
Yeah.
But certainly there's anecdotal reports of people, improving their autoimmunity, like you said, improving their energy.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's sustainable, right?
Yeah.
Because certainly maybe in that window that you mentioned, these things improve.
Yeah.
And maybe they come back later. But what do we do with that, with
Right.
people telling us that?
Well, first of all, like, I think a lot of them are self-reported.
Right.
And so a lot of them are short-term. So I felt really great. I did this for 6 months. Or I've never had someone do it for more than a couple of years and report anything. But there was a really interesting study that looked at how switching from a high protein to a high fiber diet, what happened to immune system response. So the way, like, high protein is essential for our immune system. So I'm not in any way suggesting that there isn't some benefit to eating the foods in a carnivore diet, featured in a carnivore diet. And I think for certain conditions and in certain times, actually, it could be an intervention that you try. So maybe it's for schizophrenia, maybe it's for epilepsy, or maybe it is an autoimmune condition. There's quite a lot of that I've seen.
Yeah.
Patients with things like Crohn's, flare-ups, finding that they follow a carnivore diet and it like completely resolves their symptoms. So I'm not saying, I guess if you have like a healthcare professional who can support you and monitor you, and you try that because you've tried lots of things that didn't work, I'm open to that working. But I think it's, for the majority of people, the convincing and overwhelming evidence is that the dietary patterns that support health are not carnivore diets. So it depends what we're talking about. And it's the same thing as like protein fixation in general, where people are obsessed with getting ridiculous amounts of protein in their diet. But it's like, when we look at, okay, what's your goal? Are you training for a bodybuilding competition? And so actually, you need to like build a hell of a lot of muscle, and you're training like 5 hours in the gym, lifting heavy weights. Yeah, you probably, like, your protein intake is going to be unusually high. Or are you training to live to like 98? They're two very different things. Yeah. But a lot of people are doing this one when they're trying to do this one. So like, I had one patient who, his trainer had recommended he eat 2 grams of protein per kilogram. I can't do the conversion to pounds. It's like
2.2.
Is it 2.2? So like 4 grams of protein per pound-ish, right? That's a lot. This guy the reason he was seeing people was because he unfortunately had obesity quite severely. So you're telling a person who is got a very high body weight to try and get 4 grams of protein per pound. Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Like, this guy was, to get to that, he was eating protein bars, protein shakes. Then he was having like salmon for breakfast, chicken, 5 eggs. And every day he struggled to get to that. And he wasn't feeling better, surprisingly.
What do you think of elevated protein intake to retain muscle mass?
Yeah.
Because muscle mass is something that's been significantly demonstrated to improve longevity and even potentially be protective against cognitive decline and dementia.
Which makes sense.
Is there a thread there of increasing protein intake? Does that help us retain some muscle mass or no?
So this is a really good question. I think it's really interesting because it depends what we're talking about. Are we talking about what I would call cosmetic muscle mass, where it's like, I've pumped up and I'm looking great and I'm in that, like, whatever 3% of people that have visible abs? Or are we talking about musculoskeletal mass that means I can get up from my bed by myself age 84? Right. So the evidence for the cosmetic muscle mass is that it takes quite a lot to keep it pumped up. You can't just eat the protein. You've got to do the thing. So you've got to train. But there is some evidence that especially after the age of 60, increasing your protein intake, but not by a lot, to like maybe 2 grams per pound, so like 1 gram per kilogram, can help with muscle retention. And that's because we become less efficient at absorbing protein. It's nothing to do with, it's just absorption. Like, we get worse at absorbing everything. And we have to remember that amino acid uptake into muscle cells and other cells is mediated by insulin, we become more insulin resistant with age. So like the key in the lock doesn't work so well. So if you have a bit more protein in your diet, it helps.
Yeah.
But that's later in life.
Right.
Now, like there's a hot debate about protein intake. People get very upset, and that's fine. But what I see, at least clinically, is that when people fixate on protein intake to be a certain number, it becomes the primary aim of their dietary intake, full stop. So it's damaging to what the rest of their dietary pattern looks like. And the other thing to note is that when we look at dietary data and population data, no one's protein deficient. How much protein deficiency is there in the US?
No, minimal.
No idea.
How many people are fiber deficient in the US?
I've heard you say this before, but I know it's a lot.
95%.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought that much.
95.
95 is wild.
The average adult gets 18 grams a day or less. And that's what we recommend for a 4-year-old.
Wow.
So when we look at protein intake without supplementation, tends to be nearly twice what people need already, just from food. Because everything has protein in it, pretty much, apart from butter, like certain food. So everything has protein in it. We eat a lot of food, generally, that we eat more food than we need. So guess what? We're getting more protein than we need. But then what happens is that we then fixate on like just getting protein, and we fixate on high protein foods. And we don't stop to, when we're doing like our protein calculations in the apps, we don't stop to add in the protein from the vegetables and the nuts. Like we're just like, here's how much chicken I had, here's how much salmon I had, here's like my protein shake. And so like the whole protein thing is very weird to me, because the evidence we have from longevity data and from data that we do trials in older people, so like some really nice science that you can decrease frailty, increase cognitive function. And guess what dietary intervention we'll use for that?
Mediterranean. Yeah.
And guess what Mediterranean diet isn't?
High protein.
High protein or carnivore diet. So like for me, it's not a mystery. We have plenty of data that shows us which dietary patterns. It's not just, Portfolio Diet has some good research, Dash Diet. Med is my favorite, but there's good evidence to show like what kind of diet helps people to live long independently with good cognitive function. So why are we trying to unpick that and create falsehoods about, oh, well, we're not getting enough protein? And the only time you see protein deficiency, I will say this, is people who don't eat enough food. So we have to remember we also live in a culture where food is now feared. People are scared of eating because they just don't know what they're supposed to be eating. And so oftentimes people will like supplement, and they'll really restrict their food intake. Now there may be a risk, because actually you're not eating enough food to thrive. And then the other groups that are at risk of protein deficiency, and this is going back to the fact that our immune system is a protein loving system, are people who have undergone chemotherapy and have cancer, because cancer is an incredibly immune intense activity. So actually cancer patients, and this is why cancer dietitians are so important, the likelihood of survival is strongly linked to your muscle mass when you start treatment. And that's because literally during treatment and like during cancer, your body uses your muscle as like source for protein.
That's interesting. And
then the other time where we have increased need for protein is pregnancy, because we're building a person and an extra organ to host the person. But the evidence shows that supplementing with protein in pregnancy is harmful. So if you take protein supplements in pregnancy, you're more likely to have intrauterine growth restriction, which doesn't make sense, but biology is smarter than we are, so just eat the food. Right? So those are the two, like there are times in life when, and listen, 1 in 2 people get cancer. So is it useful for people to understand that their muscle mass and their like musculoskeletal mass is really important, body composition is really important before you enter treatment? So like prehab is critical. That's important to know. But other than these times, like just maintaining good musculoskeletal mass, because you're moving functionally, you're actually leaving your desk to go for a walk for 20 minutes, you're going to the gym, or you're bending down. I don't mind. I don't, how people move is up to them. But just eating the protein isn't going to give you the musculoskeletal mass. You've got to eat food, you'll get enough protein from that, and then move your body to actually create the body that's going to sustain you for life, right?
What about some other demonized foods? We talked about saturated fat, ultra-processed foods. Dairy is something that I think there's been a fear about. But what about sugar, salt, things like that?
So sugar, I think it's clear that sugar is like the added sugar in our diet is the problem. So the thing, again, sugar has been oversimplified to mean carbohydrates.
Right.
But carbohydrates are essential for life. So, and maybe this is also where carnivore has got its footing, because the sugar, and there's a lot of influences that may have confused this, but sugar found in whole grains is not the same as table sugar. So when people are like, I don't know, these blueberries contain 5 tablespoons of sugar. It's like, no, that's not how it works, actually. So there's a few things to think about. Added table sugar to foods, and I think it's surprising to see what foods contain sugar. And that's where a lot of people think they get the extra sugar from, and they don't really necessarily realize. I think the average, something like 17 grams of added sugar in the diet every day.
Wow.
From sodas, fruit juices, condiments like ketchup, pasta sauces, soups, cereals. And some of them are like, well, yeah, I know cereal is sweet, but I don't think people realize how much that adds. So
these are all added sugars wouldn't otherwise be in the
so like
whole foods that once were.
And I don't think people realize how much 17 grams actually is.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Like, it's just a number. I'd encourage everyone to.
Not 17 grams. I think it's 17 teaspoons, which is more.
17 teaspoons.
That can't be right. It's a scary. When I saw it,
it's 17 something, folks, and it's a lot. And you should Google an image of whatever that measurement number is.
There's a lot. Look it up. I think it's either. I can, for some reason, teaspoons are cropping up in my head, but they've calculated it for children, for adults, and it's a crazy amount per day.
This is wild.
So the added sugar in our food is problematic because we're not adding it, so we're not conscious of it.
Right. 17 teaspoons.
It is.
Yeah,
so it's even more.
68 grams.
68 grams. There you go. So it is the scarier one. There you go.
Yeah.
So 70. So that's you would never. I think most people would never add 17 teaspoons of sugar to their food throughout the day.
Or to their tea or something like that.
Yeah, or like just to your meals, because that's what's happening.
Right.
But the sugar you get from whole foods like blueberries, how's that different?
So it's different because we're going back to, it's not just sugar.
Right.
There's a food matrix that makes the sugar less accessible. So whole grains, barley, right? Barley, it's a grain. Grains are good, if anyone's in doubt. Whole grains are essential. In fact, they're not just essential. A lack of whole grains in the diet is the driving risk factor for diet-related chronic disease.
A lack
of whole grains, so a low whole grain diet, is of all the sort of dietary risk factors for diet-related chronic diseases, which are the biggest killers we have. A diet low in whole grains is the biggest risk factor for diet-related chronic disease.
We've got to take a tangent here. So walk us through whole grains and then what is not whole grain,
right?
Like in the breads that we get from the store.
There's beautiful piece of research that like listed all the dietary factors that contribute to diet-related chronic diseases, and you'd expect it to be like diet high in red meats at the top, but it's not actually.
Right.
Diet low in whole grains.
Diet low in whole grains. Diet low in nuts and seeds. Diet low in omega-3 fatty acids. Diet low in pulses. They all come. Diet low in whole fruits. Actually, that's higher. Diet low in whole fruits is either 2 or 3. And I want to go back to that because everyone's scared of fruit now.
Yep.
They all come before you get to diet high in red meat, diet high in processed meat, diet high in saturated fat.
Wow.
So, but why? Right? People have taken these foods off their plates and either have ultra processed food on the plate or they have like a lot of meat on the plate. Yeah. So what we're missing from the plate, because when you take some, like, we always eat the food unless we're like heavily restricted. So if you have ultra processed foods on your plate, something's coming off.
Right.
If you're adding a huge steak to your plate, something's coming off because there's only so much we can eat, right? So whole grains, barley, pearl barley, spelt, buckwheat, quinoa, those are the top ones. Not rice.
Buckwheat is funny tasting.
I like buckwheat.
Yeah, but it's different than the others, isn't it?
It is. I like buckwheat and barley.
Yeah.
I like spelt too, actually. But
what about farro?
So yeah, farro is another word for spelt.
Okay.
Isn't it? Yeah. I think it's like different. And a lot of people think rice is, but it's not.
And not even brown rice.
It's not really a whole grain. You know, if you buy like the black rice with the husk,
Yeah.
that's technically the whole grain.
Wow.
No one buys that. It takes like 5 hours to cook. But it's delicious if you want to have that. So I don't, some people include brown rice because it's got fiber in it, but it's not a whole grain. So, and the other one that's like the unsung hero, and is the steel cut oat. Now, the thing is with oats is that they've been flattened and then finely milled to make quick cook porridge.
Right.
That's not a whole grain anymore. They've removed the good stuff. So finding steel cut oats, I'm sure you can in LA, but can be quite tricky because the quick cook have more of a market.
Yeah.
And guess where we sell the oat bran?
In the cereal aisle.
In the cereal, or as a supplement. So
Yeah.
we've just created like this cheap porridge that's not very good for you, and then we're going to sell you the bran back,
Oh,
Instead-
right.
which is genius. But so yeah, buying like the steel cut oat is great.
So again, so
Delicious.
for all of these whole grains
Yeah.
and foods that retain their matrix and haven't
Yes.
been processed down,
So they have starch in them, right?
so it takes time to break that down, and not all
Yeah.
of the sugars get through.
They don't
So
because of the
that's
food
why,
matrix. Yeah.
Teaspoon for teaspoon,
And
throwing
also-
added sugar is different.
Just taking away like the amount. What else are you getting when you're eating a whole grain? You're not just getting sugar.
Right.
It's silly to say compare it to a spoonful of sugar
Right.
because you're not getting anything else when you get that teaspoon of sugar. With a whole grain, you're getting fiber. You're getting plant protein. You're getting B vitamins. You're getting essential fatty acids. Like, it's a totally different food.
Yeah.
So to compare like table sugar to spelt is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now with fruit, if you have high fructose corn syrup added to sodas,
Right.
terrible. Not a good idea. Fructose in a blueberry. What else are you getting with the blueberry?
Yeah, right.
You're getting polyphenols. You're getting vitamins. You're getting fiber. It's a completely different thing. So the berries are an interesting example because people say, fructose is a pro-inflammatory and da-da-da-da. But you're eating a fruit that it has antioxidants in it. So any potential extra oxidization that takes place because of the fructose is cancelled out by the polyphenols. So, and that's just like, it's the same when we think about what happens. I love this question. It's like, oh, you shouldn't cook with extra virgin olive oil because it oxidizes. Okay. First of all, it's got quite a high heat point. It's higher than people think. But when you look at polyphenol content in extra virgin olive oil, it's around 600 of the like unit measure. When you look at any other oil, the closest that one gets to that. So virgin olive oil is like around 100.
Oh, wow.
And then you get to, I think, cold pressed avocado oil, which will cost you about $60 for a bottle, comes to about 10.
Whoa.
Now, all the other oils don't have any polyphenols, right? So if you say you overheat your extra virgin olive oil, and so you oxidize it a bit, what do you think happens?
No.
What do the polyphenols do? Counteract any of that oxidation.
Yeah.
So are you better off to cook with extra virgin olive oil or any other oil? Obviously, extra virgin olive oil. Not to mention the saturated fatty acid profile, like the mono and basically the very healthy fatty acid profile it has. So I know it's got vitamins. You can burn those if you heat it really highly, but you have to consider the whole food. It's not just the one component in it.
Yeah.
So thinking about the berries,
Yeah.
I go to the freezer aisle, I buy mangoes and
Yeah.
a bunch of other good frozen berries, and I put them in the blender.
Nice. Yeah.
I could do this,
Yeah.
but if I did, does that change it?
It does,
Processing it at home, does that change the matrix and the availability of the
does.
sugar?
It does. So like homemade fruit smoothies are obviously better than your store-bought sort of bottled ones. But at the end of the day, you're doing the chewing for yourself. So like the blender, when you blend the fruit, it's just two things. If you make an apple-based smoothie, right? You could blend no one really does that. Let's do bananas. So if you say you have like a smoothie with banana, blueberries, maybe some mango in there, and a bit of yogurt,
Yeah,
maybe some kefir.
sounds good.
Sounds good. You blend that up. How long does it take you to drink that?
Minutes.
Right? If that.
If that seconds, buddy.
Right? Down.
Yeah.
Now sit down and eat a banana, eat a handful of blueberries,
Yeah.
eat a piece of mango, and then have some yogurt with that. you're going to be full pretty quickly, and it's going to take you a bit. You're going to have to chew it. So the way, like blending our food, if we think about the physiology of the gut, we didn't evolve to do that. You go straight into the gullet, into the stomach. With whole foods, the stomach emptying takes a little time. Also, the chewing process is different. So like when you chew, you release enzymes, but also your signaling pathways, like your brain is like, there's food coming. Like, let's let the liver know, that can let the pancreas know, let's release the hormones needed. That takes some time to get to optimal levels. Like we've bypassed that if we're drinking our food. And so then you get to the small intestine really much quicker than you would have done if you'd eaten the thing. And the small intestine, it's already blended. There's no more work to do to break the food down to absorb the fructose and the other nutrients. So in some ways, so if you were asking me about maybe, a child or someone who was struggling to put on weight or was struggling to get enough nutrition from their food for whatever reason, this can also apply to people who have like gut issues. So then actually smoothies are really helpful because you're making it easier for their body to absorb the nutrients where they can't. But for the average adult, like eat your food, don't blend it. And so you can imagine how I feel about drinking your lunch, which is another big trend at the moment. It's like, when did we become so removed from our evolutionary past that we don't want to dedicate any time in our day to preparing food and sharing it with people? And actually, I've seen marketing campaigns for these brands where they literally go up to people in the street and like, did you know that we spend 2 hours of our day thinking about food? Well, now you don't need to because you can just drink it. I was like, this is horrible. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we making that okay? So, and it's the same thing. Like, we're not designed to swallow food straight down, absorb everything into the small intestine because it's all broken down and easy to absorb. Our liver has to sort that out. Sometimes people think that like from our small intestine, it just like gets absorbed into our blood. No, like the liver is a central metabolic organ that has to receive this stuff, package it up, distribute it, put it away. Like it has to work to do that. It's hard work. And so if you're flooding it with this stuff in one go, instead of, if you imagine when you're chewing your food and it comes through, like it trickles down, especially if you have a high fiber diet, right? It takes time, it comes down, a little bit of gets absorbed, the liver like does its thing. Here we're going whoosh. Same with protein supplements. You're drinking 20 grams of protein. Your poor liver. Why are you doing that to
it? Speaking of marketing campaigns, there's a big I think it's been for a while now, counting calories, right? That's where the Diet Coke, Diet Soda thing comes in. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think calories obviously are, when we think about food, one of the things we think about is energy. Like how much energy does this food technically contribute? So I'm not like in the calories don't exist camp, because they do. And they're a useful way to think about things like how much. So back after the war, Second World War, it was like there isn't enough calories in our food environment to feed the people that live here. That was like a big thing. Now we have an average of 4,000 calories per adult, slightly overshot the mark. So it's it's like a useful tool to think about whether there's enough food available in theory. In practice, a calorie is not a calorie. In practice, what we just talked about. And so our chief scientist, Professor Sarah Berry, has done some cool science on this, where she's fed people whole almonds and then ground almonds and then like an almond powder, basically, an almond and a butter. And there's a very different effect between the three. Like how much energy you actually extract from the almond is vastly different. If it's a whole almond, you have to chew. So, just because the back of pack for almonds will have the same calories, whether they are whole or ground, it'll have the same calories, but that's not how you absorb it. So then we think about how you use it. You say we've absorbed the calories from the food, and they will be absorbed differently according to how you've prepared it, how much you've chewed it. So like rate of eating massively impacts how much sugar you absorb from your food as well. So if you eat very quickly, you tend to have a higher and faster blood glucose spike. So there's all these factors. And then after that, it's like how you use it is very different. If you're somebody who is very active with high musculoskeletal mass, or you're doing like very intense work with using your brain a lot, you use a lot of energy, especially your brain, like loves glucose, right? Whereas if you're somebody who then is very sedentary or like doesn't do much or isn't using their brain in that particular, like you're not going to use it as much. So then we go into like, okay, how much of that energy are you storing and how much are you using? Yep. How effective are you at storing? So are you insulin sensitive or insulin resistant? Or do you not produce enough insulin? Are your storage cupboards, so your muscles and your fat and your liver, are they full or are they empty? So do you have capacity to store this energy somewhere? All of these factors are not reflected in calorie count. So my problem with calories is, A, it's a super reductionist way to look at food. We've just spoken about energy. We've discussed today how food also contributes to your gut microbiome composition. It contributes to vitamins and minerals. It contributes to other nutrients that are essential for life. So just looking at energy content, like that's one thing, very reductionist. And actually, it's not a very accurate measure, because if I eat 100 calories and you eat 100 calories, it has a different effect on us. So why is that a useful measure for a person? Population level, public health, understanding food availability, I get it. Or understanding energy, like, do we need to do something here? But when people are trying to make food choices, okay, again, what's your goal? If you're trying to reduce your energy intake so that you lose weight, it can work, right? Energy, like calorie restriction, works to help people lose weight. Is it sustainable? Not according to any of the science I've seen, right? Does it account for dietary quality? No. So like you can eat, there was that famous guy who like ate McDonald's every day, but lost weight. No, that he like did calorie restriction with McDonald's. Oh, okay. So lost weight.
This dude did not lose weight.
But the calories were.
They were all from, he felt terrible. I think he actually ended up with deficiencies. Anyway, so like it's not enough to help people make smart food choices. You want to be able to eat a diet that supports your health as well as whatever goal you might have. You might have a short-term goal as well. And using calorie restriction alone, I think no nutrition scientist would disagree with me that using calorie restriction alone is never a good idea for an individual. And especially and whenever people do use calories, they have to remember that it's a very imprecise measure. And we also know that people self-marking their calorie intake is wildly wrong. So there's usually like a huge margin of error. So it's like, why are we still talking about calories? In all honesty, like there's such a better way to think about food. And it goes back to this idea that we've removed ourselves from the power of food. We've removed ourselves from the pleasure of food and how much joy it can bring, because we've reduced it to this like how many macros, micros, and calories. So, oh my God, we don't eat those things. We don't just eat fat or protein, and we don't eat calories. We eat food. Where's food?
So Atia just had Eric Ravison on, who developed a calorie study, which was a calorie restriction study down to 800 calories a day, so pretty low.
Fast mimicking?
What's that?
It's like a fast mimicking diet?
Yeah. And so he, there was a heavy screening process to get the people that he thought would adhere to 2 years of restriction and follow them across that time with blood biomarkers, primary, secondary aging biomarkers, and then obviously how do they feel, and do they lose weight, and do they maintain that weight loss. And so these individuals, which all would agree, including him and the authors of the studies, are unique. You know, those that could adhere to a rigorous trial like that. Right, exactly. And so they benefited across the board, you know, in everything you could possibly imagine. So then it gives this idea, a lot of weight and energy, that restricting calories is the only way, or is one of the most sustainable ways to maintain that weight loss. Even in follow-ups 10 years after the study's been done, people are still different, having done that calorie restriction. But they were also given education. That was
so
one
their
of the primary
dietary
things.
quality
They were
was
coming
good?
to the lab, sometimes daily to get advice about how to kind of make up with it. Yeah. So it can't possibly be as simple as calorie restriction.
No, and it goes back to dietary quality.
No.
So like if your calorie and the fast mimicking movement is interesting because it clearly has an effect, but the interventions are always very high quality foods.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you're restricting your calorie intake, but the foods you're eating are highly nutritious foods with low calorie density plants.
Yeah.
So it's often very plant heavy, and you get this benefit of having a high quality diet with calorie restriction. So you are reducing your energy expenditure.
Mm-hmm.
But when we look at average people who aren't the super loggers, like they just don't do very well with the dietary quality piece and also with dealing with the hunger piece.
Right.
So and people experience hunger very differently. We're seeing that now with GLP-1 agonists, right? Some people it works beautifully for them, others it doesn't. It doesn't have the effect. So again, there's variability in how people respond to hunger and how well they can tolerate hunger, and that does dictate how well they can adhere to these things.
Can we expand on the GLP-1 agonists a little bit? What are your thoughts on them? What are they doing to the microbiome? What are the long-term implications of something like this? Things like that.
So, I mean, everyone knows the science is still like the longest trial's been running, 5 years? So who knows? I think there's a couple of things. I think it's definitely a medical breakthrough. And when we're thinking about the obesity as a global public health crisis, the time it's going to take us to undo 40 years of poor food environment is going to take a while to prevent obesity. And we know that a child who has obesity or overweight is 5 times more likely to be an obese adult. So okay, let's do this work on the prevention. But in the meantime, what can we do to help people who already have the condition, who already have obesity? And I think this, as a medical breakthrough, no doubt is amazing, because when people, the other options are surgery, which is a very intense intervention with its own risks. So to be able to recreate the same success as surgery with not so many less risks is actually pretty impressive.
Yes.
But in my view, we should be treating GLP-1 agonist use in the same way that we treat surgery. So when people have surgery, they have prehab, intense dietary intervention, and follow-up care to make sure that they can basically still eat well enough to sustain health, because they have this reduced gastric capacity. With GLP-1, it's wild. It's like, here you go, bye, good luck. No education, right? You can pretty much buy the thing on TikTok. And so the danger for me isn't so much the drug is effective and it's helping people to massively reduce their risk of death from the complications that obesity brings. So you can't deny that that's pretty cool for those people who are at high risk.
Right.
Everyone else is problematic, because when you have someone who doesn't need to lose weight for medical reasons or isn't at risk or has type 2 diabetes, and they're taking this drug for cosmetic reasons, so they just want to lose weight, there's no support there. Well, actually, there's no dietary support even for those who do have obesity. So what happened, so we had a case study in the BMJ reported just weeks ago of somebody who had been prescribed GLP-1 for their obesity, had no dietary support, was on a low income, and presented to hospital with scurvy.
Wow.
Because he was only able to afford 1 meal a day, and that was coming from fast ultra-processed food.
Right.
Very quickly developed a micronutrient deficiency that we don't really associate with this century.
I do also wonder, in terms of the GLP-1s, what is the plan when someone goes on it? Is there a plan to wean off? Is there a plan to, after a certain weight, kind of cut back, titrate off? And this is going off the reservation a little bit, but clinically what I've seen is something similar in psychiatric medications, right? Where, someone has postpartum depression, right? Came at postpartum depression, got started on a psychiatric medication. I was like, oh, so you had your baby, this year, within the last year or something. Oh no, that was 20 years ago, right? And they were still, they thought they were still on the same medication for their postpartum depression. So that back to the GLP-1s, is there some sort of plan moving forward to wean them off, anything like that?
So I mean, the trials suggest that people that come off them, quite a large proportion regain the weight.
Yeah.
Because when you stop taking the medication, you're hungry again and you eat.
Mm-hmm.
And our physiology doesn't like big weight change. And with these medications, we're talking about like 20% of your body weight is huge.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine that your metabolism, especially if it's been quite recent. So if you've been on the medication for like 3 months, I've seen this quite a lot. 3 months of medication, you lose the weight. And then, I'm going to come off it now. 3 months is not very long. So if you think about the weight set point theory, which is one of the theories around why people rebound with weight loss, that's not long enough for that set point to change. So your body is then going to fight. And this is it makes sense in evolution if we look at like if you go through a famine thousands of years ago, like your body's then going to try and get you back to the weight you were originally, because that was like a healthy weight.
Right.
This applies to whatever weight you start with. So even if your initial weight wasn't healthy, your body's still going to do the same mechanism to try and get you back to your set point, because homeostasis. And so like if you've been on GLP-1 agonists for 3 months and you come off them and you just go back to what you were doing, you'll regain the weight. Now my biggest red flag here, and we'll go back to like what the plan is, but the biggest red flag here is that any weight loss, you lose fat and muscle. That's normal. It's not just a GLP-1 thing. It's just how it works, right? But rapid weight rebound, you don't regain the weight as muscle mass. You regain it as fat mass. And this is, again, unless you're like going to the gym and doing loads of resistance training, majority of people who come off it regain it as fat mass. And so now if this population of this person had come in because they had obesity and they took the medication and they lost the weight and then they rebound and regain the weight as fat mass, you're then now looking at a population with sarcopenic obesity where their muscle mass is actually less than when they started the treatment, which is why the dietary and exercise interventions alongside the GLP-1 are so critical, because also there's quite a high intolerance to the side effects. So what's the plan? Technically, it's a lifelong prescription. The hope is that you could titrate down, but actually what tends to happen is you have to titrate up to get to the effect. So I wonder whether in some patients, and we'll see from the trials, if as they continue running, there's more stuff coming out. You might be able to like try titrate back down eventually, and that would be better, I think, overall. But the question for me is also like, what does this have with any signaling molecule? When you interfere with the feedback loop, what is it doing? So it's like we've started seeing the first like Ozempic babies, right, where people take the drug, their fertility goes up because obesity obviously decreases fertility. They get pregnant like by mistake because they didn't realize, and they're taking the GLP-1 for the first weeks of pregnancy. What happens? Because it's like it impacts the signal molecule which we normally have in our body. It's like much higher doses when you're taking this drug. So I think it's here to stay, and there's obviously clear benefits for certain populations, but I think that the unregulated and unsupported use of it is going to create new problems. As usual, whenever something new comes along, there's always like, oh, we didn't see that coming. We didn't see. And so, and for me, like sarcopenic obesity is one where that's a problem, because then you're really looking at a worse aging outcome.
Right.
And then the other one is just understanding better, like when we're tampering with these signaling molecules, like what's actually happening in terms of the feedback loop being disrupted. It's never just one thing.
Right.
They're so, it's so complicated. Right. And then, and hopefully, but what I do hope is that the trends of like teenagers using it, there's so much disordered eating.
Yeah. I had like one of my assistants came to me and he was like, hey, should I go on, Ozempic? I was like, why? And, the guy's like 24 years old or something. He's like, yeah, my primary care physician wants to put me on it because he says, I'm overweight. But he's just, a stocky guy, very, high muscle mass. And I guess PCP just used like his BMI to be able to determine where he's at. And then, is just offering it to him. So I think I see that happening a lot, not only in these populations that really need it, but it's been expanded to pretty much
anyone. And so what you're seeing, interestingly, is that now fashion, which had become much more diverse, suddenly like super skinny is back. And it's funny, but I wonder what you guys think about the effects it has on like addiction, because it's quite interesting research on like a side effect has been people stop smoking, or like it's reduced addictive behaviors. So there's a potential use case for it in addiction.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And I actually I know somebody who took it for cosmetic weight loss, which wasn't great, but actually like an unwanted pleasant side effect is that he's reduced his drinking. So, and he's like, I just don't want to anymore. And so is there like maybe a potential application for it where it could be beneficial in some mental health conditions?
Yeah, I think possibly. But isn't there a concern on the flip side of things? When could it exacerbate pre-existing mental health conditions that we see very typically with, especially with people that are significantly obese? You know,
and there was that suicide study, right, where there seemed to be, Anyway, so it's one of those. I think it's one of those where we'll find out more from the trials. We'll find out more from reporting in real life.
Right.
But people are going to need support.
But people shouldn't. They shouldn't. It's not like you shouldn't just take it.
Yeah.
Right. You need to have that much of an impact on your body composition. You need to think about. So we talked about dietary quality a lot today. It couldn't be more important if you're only eating one meal a day.
Right.
So if you're if you're having such a reduced food intake, then the food you're eating has to be nutrient dense, because otherwise you will decrease your nutrient intake. And guess what? Supplements are not the answer.
Yeah.
Because we know that supplements never do the thing like food does.
Right.
Like it just doesn't add up.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest watch out. And we've learned this from bariatric surgery. Bariatric surgery patients who don't have a high quality nutrient dense diet tend to have worse outcomes. And supplements don't fix that.
There's a couple things I think we should hit before we tie up. The one, we talked about that golden window, the first 1,000 days, and still more things that you could do through adolescence, teen years, young adulthood. But maybe before 40 is really the sweet spot where dietary things then predict, how you're going to age and whether you're going to be at risk of neurodegeneration. But is there hope for people over 40?
Yeah, loads of hope. So there's a really nice modelling study that was done that looked at how dietary change at 40 could add up to 10 or 11 years to your life. There was that study that came out which made loads of, it was actually only an abstract, I think, but people were like, oh my
Classic.
God. Yeah, it was like, I was like, okay. But a really decent research group, but I was like, yeah, okay. But anyway, age 46, your diet at age 46 was like the most powerful predictor of risk of dementia. So there's all these things that we know. If you change your diet in your 40s, your 50s, your 60s, your 70s, that same modelling study from UK Biobank, a really huge data set.
Right.
Up to 7 years added to your life. So it's always worth doing it. It's just different.
Not much adds 7 years to your life.
Right.
Exactly. If you could put that in a pill, you'd be retiring on a private island somewhere.
But you've also mentioned before, and I think it's important to note that, increasing lifespan is not only what we're trying to do, but then also the quality of that life, right? Yeah.
So the health span is really important. And I think what's really exciting about nutrition is that medicine has increased our lifespan for the most part. Like we don't die from cholera or we don't die from infection very often, or less so. We can treat cancers, we can treat things, so we live longer, but our health span hasn't actually caught up with that. So there's something called the health gap. It's actually more pronounced in women than men, and we're on average 20 years of our lives is actually spent on poor health, which doesn't sound great. So, and the most powerful tool we have for increasing health span is our dietary pattern. So if you want to live to like 88 and live well, then what you eat is really important. And when you make that change, makes a massive impact on that outcome. The thing with like, so say you make a change at 68. On average, US adults by 68 already have at least one chronic condition. I think it goes up quite a lot. Like polypharmacy starts to creep in fairly quickly, like 60, like by 75, I think most adults have some sort of polypharmacy going on, which is like this prescription of several drugs to treat several risk factors that then themselves have side effects. So if in some cases, if you start later, it does move from primary prevention into secondary prevention, where like you have the thing, but at least we can reduce the impact of it on your health. But that's still super important. So again, one of my favorite studies is the New Age 1 study. So they took a bunch of adults in a care home setting who had quite a high frailty score. So frailty is like the opposite of resilience, is how I think of it. And there's no age limit for frailty. You can be frail in your 50s, but it's essentially like a measure of how well your body is going to deal with a challenge.
Sure.
And you don't want a high frailty score because it means that anything like a cold could put you in hospital for a while. So they took these patients who already had quite a high frailty score, and then they gave them a Mediterranean dietary intervention. And they looked at their frailty score 3 months later. And what was cool about this study is that they looked at the sort of the mediating factor, microbiome, and they reduced frailty score across the board. So like from grip strength to cognitive function, like it all improved with just a dietary intervention. That's all they did. So there's so much potential even in older age, and even if we do already have frailty, there's always time and there's always good reason to change your diet and to like make that change, introduce these foods back on our plates that we've lost, and start treating our food as like a really central part of our day. So prioritize it again. You should take time to make yourself lunch. You should take time. Like, if anyone is going to fire you for taking a lunch break, maybe you should change the job. Because what is that? So there's lots of, and reconnect with friends and loved ones over food, share meals together. So it's about changing the way we perceive food. It's not just there. We don't just have to eat to keep going. That's definitely not the thing. Like we're not cars. Food is so much more than that. It gives us the potential to feel really good today, like have more energy, get out of bed and feel good, have a clear mind. But it's also an investment which is going to accumulate over time and make sure that you get more healthy life years. And, you know, people often say, oh, you know, you can't predict when you're going to die. 100%. I might get run over by a bus. Like somebody, you know, you might develop a really rare form of cancer. Like there's all these other factors. But even though you can't predict when you're going to die, if you eat well, you'll enjoy your life in the meantime, and you're going to give yourself better health in that time, like, regardless. And crucially, if you do then get hit with a rare disease or really unfortunate, something happens, your resilience to that is going to be much better than if you had poor nutritional status. So going back, you know, I know people who have been struck with cancer in their 30s, like a BRCA positive breast cancer or really rare lung disease for a non-smoker, all this stuff. Their ability to survive treatment and survive the cancer, like it's not just my friends, we know this, that it is impacted by the nutritional status. So Dr. Spector did a trial called PRIM, which looked at whether giving cancer patients who were about to have immunotherapy for melanoma, gave them Mediterranean dietary intervention before. You've read the study, before treatment, or just normal care, right? So no dietary intervention. It improved survival to the immunotherapy by 40%. Wow! Just changing their diet. Now, of course, immunotherapy is a very strong contender for dietary change because we've spoken about the role of the microbiome for the immune system to function. But we know this stuff. So
even from a mental health standpoint, I've seen some evidence showing that a healthy gut microbiome might lead to resiliency, so decreasing the risk for the development of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
So even from a mental health standpoint, there seems to be some sort of connection or association there.
That's amazing. Yeah.
I wanted to come back just to one more thing. Combining what you said about the pleasure of eating, and some things I think were between the lines with how you speak about the approach to eating and getting your kids to have a healthy relationship with food. The intuitive diet, using your own cues of hunger and satiation to drive your health and food decisions. Maybe you could just talk on the pleasure of eating and intuitive diet.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because people have lost touch with their own hunger, but that's because of the conditioning, right? So I love I love thinking about toddlers. If a toddler's hungry, they will not stop until you give them some food, right? And if they're full, they won't eat another bite. Doesn't matter what you do. Like they will close their mouth and they will turn their head and they will physically resist you feeding them. That is a classic. That's the most perfect example of intuitive eating. Like they eat when they're hungry. They don't eat when they're not. They drink when they're thirsty. They don't drink when they're not. It's very simple. Now, so we are programmed to be like that from birth. And then over time, we're told to override it. And it's often not malicious. It's like, Mummy, I want a snack. Oh, you can't possibly want a snack. You can't be hungry. You just ate. You hear that all the time. And the kid's like, but I feel hungry, right? And so we unknowingly program children to not trust their own hunger and satiety. Or like, Mummy, I don't want to eat this right now. I'm not hungry. Oh, just have one bite. Just have one bite. Just eat the broccoli and then you can go play, whatever. You're overriding the satiety signaling. Now, I'm a parent. I know that then 5 minutes later, or even more annoying, like an hour and a half later,
everything's away.
I'm hungry. It's like, well, you should have eaten it. Damn. So it's just, but override, like telling them they're not something is so confusing because they're like, but I feel it, but you're telling me not to. So you sort of, disassociation is a strong word, but you do disassociate your physical feeling from the thing because you're like, well, okay, I'm not then, if that's what I'm. So building that back is super hard. I work with a lot of, especially women, I have to say, who have completely lost touch. They don't know when they're hungry. They don't know where they're full. They eat what they're told to eat. So these are often my patients who come to clinic and they're like, can you just give me a precise food plan? I want to know. I have one patient actually who's a man and he's like obsessed with his ApoB. And he wants like a precise food plan. You probably know what doctor he went to. Precise food plan, like how many cups of this? And I say to him, you got to like go with the flow a bit and just eat as much as you want. He's like, no. I'm like, no, yeah. So undoing that sometimes is super tricky because it's been there for years and decades. And they expect to like have the same salad for lunch, have the same breakfast. Actually, a lot of my American patients have this. They have the same breakfast, the same lunch, the same snack, the same dinner every day. And they have the same portion every day and they don't change it. And so when I say to them, so what I want you to do is like, eat when you feel hungry. And they're like, what? I'm like, and if you're still hungry after that meal, like have a bit more until you're full. And it's like, but it takes time to rebuild it. And it means that another thing we have to think about is like, when you're eating, don't be on your emails. Try not, TV's less bad in a way, but like try not to be doing something else, which means that your mind is completely off what you're doing because it's very much harder to listen to your satiety cues. And this is with children as well. Like try not to feed your kids in front of the TV. Try and help them engage with like, what does it taste like? Which is your favorite bit? And this, not every day, it can't happen every day, but just try it and help them to know, like see what it tastes like. Are you full? Is your tummy full or is it still empty? Do you want it a bit more? So that really helps. I think what's really exciting. So Zoe, we're the only personalized diet company that actually encourages positive nutrition. So it's everything we do in our membership in the app encourages people to add more of these foods we're lacking back onto the plate. And there's no calories and there's no portion control. It's literally just make this recipe and eat as much as you want. And actually, have you considered adding some extra bit of this to this recipe? And so it's flipping that mindset to how do we help people reconnect with eating abundance of food, a variety of things, like 30 plants a week is like one of the things that people have really resonated with. 30 plants a week sounds more exciting than 5 a day, right? 30 plants a week means you have to be a bit creative and actually introduce spices, introduce herbs, reintroduce nuts and seeds into your diet. Because when you buy the mixed beans in a tin, you're getting 3 types of bean. So that's like 3 instead of 1. And it becomes fun. It's like, actually, I want to see if I can get there. So I'm going to start chopping garlic back into my meals because that's a plant. So it's like, and when it's really amazing to see like when the shift happens, there's one of my patients who I love her, and she'd been diet culture classic for her entire life and had the salad every day, like the same meal. And when she started enjoying her food again, that was best outcome for me. She was like, I love my meals. Like, I'm really enjoying it. And I stopped eating when I'm full. And it was such a change. And she was like, I'm not scared of food anymore. And that in itself is enough of a mind switch that almost always guarantees that person then goes on to eat a more healthy dietary pattern that's sustained.
Yeah. So, you're doing microbiome testing with Zoe, and you're doing some amazing work there, and I'd encourage everyone to check that out.
Yeah.
But is there any way, without me signing up for Zoe,
that
I can look at my poop
there is.
And know that I might be doing the right thing in regards to my gut health?
Yeah, so there's two things, okay? So the first thing is transit time.
Okay.
So transit time means how long does it take for the thing to go from your mouth to your toilet.
Okay.
Do you call it toilet here?
Yeah.
Or loo, I don't know. I never know. So then how do we do that? 2 ways. Eat a bunch of beetroot. Don't have a heart attack.
Okay.
Anyone who's had like a beet salad.
Yeah.
I remember, so when I moved to New York, it was like beet salad was the thing. Do you remember this?
Yes,
it was like a big thing. And I'd never eaten a sole beet salad where it was just beets. And I just moved to the US, and like 2 days later, I'd eaten so many beets that my actual urine turned pink. And I was like,
I'm bleeding.
Oh my God, I have a kidney infection. And then I was like, oh no, I just ate loads of beets. So, but you get the same thing when you eat like a good amount of beets, your poo will turn like red or pink. So that you can measure. So essentially like measure what time you ate the beet and then check your poop, which people should do anyway. They don't. And just see like when the color appears. You can do this with sweet corn. So if you eat a bunch of corn, because it's so hard to break down, you tend to see it in your poop. You just have to eat quite a lot of it. Or you can make like a blue muffin. So blue is another color that shows up very strongly. Measure that transit time. And we did a big study called the blue poo study. And we had like the whole nation do blue poos with muffins. And because so many people took part, so we did like a big citizen science project, we actually found that the sweet spot of transit is between about 14 hours and about 30 hours.
Wow.
So that's like a healthy transit time. So really...
It's longer than I would have expected.
Yeah, 30 hours.
Yeah. So just over a day.
It's a high ceiling.
No, it's not. So like, pooping daily is the ideal situation.
I think the perception is that you eat and then you have to have a bowel movement. You feel like
people think
things
that,
have but
no, but the gastrocolic reflex makes you feel like that.
Right.
So when you eat, and this is people who don't have nerve damage in their gut, sometimes this can be really disruptive if you have bowel surgery and the gastrocolic reflex goes. So gastrocolic reflex means when you eat. So if you think of your gastric tube, it's like one long tube. As soon as you hit up here, like it starts to do this movement called peristalsis, and it travels all the way down. And so then it moves like the food through your large intestine as well. And it's quite a long, large area. So when you eat your breakfast, it's usually breakfast, tends to like your gut's had a rest overnight, peristalsis has gone down. You have your breakfast and you get the gastrocolic reflex. A large number of people go to the toilet in the morning after breakfast. But that's yesterday's, or maybe like normally yesterday's food if you're not constipated.
Right.
So that's the kind of sweet spot. And that is a really good, when we compared that transit time to gut microbiome composition, it's actually a very good correlation. It's like people with healthy gut microbiome composition tend to have a transit time in this gap. He won't mind me saying this, but like, of course, Tim Spector is like on the 15, 16 hour. He's like super efficient.
Optimized transit
of course
time.
He is.
Perfect.
Yeah. But really, if you're going to the loo twice a day, that's really good. But if occasionally, and especially in women, cycle phase can impact the motility of your gut. So it might be like a day and a bit. That's good. If your transit time is longer than that, that is a sign of constipation. Another thing we did was something called the Big Poo Review. The titles are good. The largest ever survey of bowel movements.
Wow.
And we had over 40,000 participants that logged their bowel movements for us. And, I think because it's on an app and it's anonymous, people were very honest with us. It was a real treasure trove of data for like understanding. And we found a shocking amount of people suffered with such severe constipation, I think 9%, of such severe constipation they had to manually evacuate.
Wow.
That's insane.
9%.
9%.
Wow.
So that's like, that just tells you, and constipation is something which people think it's like a transient issue. Like constipation is really not good. Like people feel terrible.
Yeah.
It increases bloating. So often people say they're bloated, but it's a result of constipation.
Sure.
Then you get paradoxical diarrhea where they think they actually go into the loo, but it's not. It's bad. So it's something to look at. And what I would say is constipation later in life can actually be dangerous. So a lot of hospitalizations in older people is
about small bowel obstruction.
Yeah. So anyway, that was really interesting. And you can do that. That's one way of like understanding your gut microbiome composition. And then the other thing is like your gastric symptoms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're suffering with bloating, you're suffering with constipation or unpredictable like bowel movements, it's a sign that your gut's not happy and not performing super well. And I mean, I would go as far as to say that if your mental health is suffering a lot, like that's another sign. Like if your gut microbiome isn't happy, your mental health, all the research we have suggests that your mental health will suffer. So those things to look out for. And of course, like we know there's such a high fiber deficiency that is literally why we created Daily 30.
Yeah, 95% was striking.
Yeah, that's literally because when you think about, so what would the vast majority of the population benefit from? Increasing their fiber intake and their plant diversity, so you get the variety of fibers for the microbiome. So that's why we created the Daily 30 supplement.
Yeah. What about smell?
The smell of poo. Oh, right. So if we're going down like the identifying, that's more like, so change in color, change in smell can be a sign of dysbiosis, but it can also be a sign of something more serious. So going back to like the colorectal cancer awareness thing, you know, any kind of new pain in the gut, and IBS, one of the hallmarks of IBS is pain. So it's new pain. But also like if there's a color, like a black color or bright red tends to be lower down. So, but if you get something that looks like blood or like, don't expect, it's definitely a red flag. And then smell can be actually is one of the flags for colorectal cancer. So getting, especially, so in some of the questionnaires, it's like described as being particularly acidic smelling. So burny smell. If that happens regularly, you might have eaten something dodgy, but if it's something that you notice, like it's definitely worth speaking to your doctor about it. Yes, like our poo is a real insight to what's happening. And it's also worth noting that like different medications impact all what we've spoken about, like our microbiome composition and how we poop and how regularly we poop. One of the things that is very regularly prescribed and has a negative impact on our gut health is proton pump inhibitors. So being aware of that, and to your point, review your meds. Like is if there's something that you can change, or if you're like someone who has very regular heartburn and you're actually popping Pepto-Bismol like every day. Is that here? Pepto-Bismol? Is that here? Not good. Like you need to address why that's happening, because there's a downstream consequence and probably a cause that needs to be addressed for that symptom.
The thing we're trying to bring in this podcast is something more tangible, and we've gotten into the weeds. We've talked about some of the science. We've zoomed in on micronutrients and some demonized foods, some things that are probably okay, some hidden truths about whole grains and whatnot. But maybe you can walk us through how you would shop for the week. And think about breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks. And maybe if we have time to go through the infant aisle, what we would look for.
Okay, so I think of it, instead of the aisles, I think about what do you need on your plate, because then it applies to any meal. So whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, build your plate up with split it into quarters in your mind. Okay, so like one half is plants, leafy greens, root veg, beets, colorful mushrooms, whatever you like in terms of plants. The more variety, the better. So if you can get some cabbage in there and like maybe see what's seasonal to you, go for it. Then 1/4 quadrant is going to be like your whole grains. And sometimes it'll be the pearl barley and the spelt. Sometimes it might be a good quality durum wheat pasta. And maybe some other days it's like not a whole grain, it's a rice, but that, you know, basically a carbohydrate source, ideally higher quality, is one quadrant. And then your final quadrant is where you put your preferred protein source. This should vary between oily fish, if you eat meat, occasional white meat or red meat, so like they should both be less frequent, beans, lentils, tofu, tempeh, and then sprinkled on top of your plate, you have sources of good fat. That varies from avocado to nuts and seeds, extra virgin olive oil. So that sounds good.
Yep.
You got that. Now, when we think about changes, though, often people like to think, hey, what should I change first? Because you can have this basic template for your dishes and it works across the day. But often what we find is like there's two things that are easy to change because it tends to be more within people's agency and they contribute a large amount of the energy like intake. So the first is breakfast, which on average is 20% of our energy intake for the day. So it's quite a portion of that.
Yeah.
So if you can change your breakfast, people tend to be home or they tend to be able to grab something from home to take with them. So it applies to either scenario. And breakfast, if you can change that to include these foods, so it can look like having a yogurt that you, like an overnight yogurt that you made the day before with like a bit of natural yogurt, some whole grains in it. So maybe you put some porridge oats in there, some frozen berries, some nuts and seeds. You've got yourself like a fiber-rich, nutrient-dense, polyphenol, everything done. And you can just put it in the fridge. They keep in the fridge for 4 days. Yeah. So you can make them in a batch, take them with you. Or it might mean that you're actually boiling a couple of eggs and then putting a little pot of hummus with crudités in it. And you're taking that with you and a handful of nuts and an apple. And that's like on the go. So there's different ways of doing things that don't have to be super hard. If you're home, you might be able to make yourself like a lovely omelette with vegetables and mushrooms and spinach. And you might then have a really nice sourdough rye bread, which isn't strictly like a whole grain in itself, but it's one of those carbohydrate sources that can be high quality, and enjoy that at home. And you could even have some smoked salmon with that. So there's different ways of doing it that are either quicker or a bit have a bit more time. You could be making your steel cut oat porridge with nuts and seeds, berries, a little bit of kefir in there, right? Then you have the other thing that contributes actually on average 25% of energy intake. So it's even more is our snacks.
Wow.
So we love snacking. The US and UK are like massive snacking nations. And so one study that Professor Sarah Berry did, was actually just swapping snacks to almonds. And it improved the participants' blood markers across the board. And that's like a pretty simple switch.
Raw almonds.
Just almonds. It wasn't even raw. Just unsalted though. So like just roasted,
not
or raw,
chocolate covered
almonds. Yeah. So like, because we don't realize, and the reason why we have such a high intake of energy from snacks is because they're high, like they're energy dense. It's not because we load like big snacks. No. It's because they tend to be like, frankly, unhealthier. So biscuits or protein bars, like they're just full of crap. Or it might be like they're high energy and not very healthy. So if you can switch your snacks to like a handful of almonds and a fresh piece of fruit, or to like a little yogurt pot with just actual food, whole food that is beneficial, you can make a big difference there. So I think start with breakfast, then tackle your snacks. And then when you're building plates for lunch or dinner, try and follow that approach of how you build the plate. So what does that mean for your grocery shopping? Well, it means like the first thing is try not to buy ultra processed foods at all, because you don't need to. Actually, there's foods that are easy to carry and quick to make that you can just have at home. Leave ultra processed foods for when you're out and you don't have a choice. Or for specific things that, like we talked about, that are a bit more nuanced. So maybe you're not used to eating beans, but you quite like baked beans. It's like, okay, have that. Sure. Or maybe a rye bread or a sourdough isn't affordable to you because they're really expensive. So you might buy like a granary bread from the supermarket, which is technically ultra processed, but it's on that spectrum of like actually good to have in your diet. It's not going to harm you. So try and limit though what those ultra processed foods are, and the ones that you do buy, make them these staples that have beneficial things in them. So that your actual dark chocolate covered almonds are a good example of like the dark chocolate covered almond, which may constitute as a UPF because it's been processed in some way, is going to be better for you than buying, I'm going to say Twinkies again, but they're both snack foods.
Right.
Or like the Snickers bar, which is nuts and chocolate but very different.
Right.
So try and limit those. Go to the unsexy aisles, like go to the middle aisle, bottom shelf, and just try and buy some of the whole grains, try and buy some of the lentils, and start experimenting with those. Then get the frozen berries, get the frozen vegetables that are easy for you to make at home, like the broccoli, the cauliflower, frozen green beans, all these things, and add those to your shopping. And where you can, like, buy produce that's affordable to you. So like yogurt, eggs, maybe you buy a whole chicken. Like buying a whole chicken is more convenient, it's more economically like affordable than buying chicken parts. You get more chicken for your money. And you can then like use the carcass for broth. There's other things you can do. So like a little bit of that. I think buying the basic stuff like the carrots, the onions, the garlic, and the fresh fruit, having them in them at home and making an effort to like chop them up and add them to your cooking adds flavor, and also actually is contributing to your fiber intake and to your diversity of plants. So and our key part of this is, of course, what we were talking about earlier, which is the cooking skills. So if you can invest in a cooking course, it's a good one to do. If you can't, there's lots of information available online. So like our Instagram account has loads of recipes. So that's like at Zoe. There's also lots of recipes available in different cookbooks and websites. So like try and see things that inspire you to cook different foods.
What about fermented foods?
Yeah, so fermented foods is like super easy to make, right? No, kefir is a bit temperamental actually. So you can buy kefir from the store, although if you can find a kefir that's actually made with kefir grains, which you can't buy in store because it would explode because they're very live. So like the store-bought kefirs are essentially yogurts that have strains added to them. Just because kefir grains are literally live. So if you buy real kefir, or you can buy kefir grains online, by the way, and make your own with milk. What you'll see is like every day that goes by that it changes more. It like keeps fermenting. You got to take the grains out at some point. Or you get cottage cheese. And then basically they're really good to include. But sauerkraut is so easy to make. Like I make it with my kids. You chop cabbage up, wash it, put it in a bowl, add some salt. Like it's about 5% of the weight. So for a cabbage, I'd say like a teaspoon of salt is enough. And everyone's like, oh my God, that's loads of salt. Don't worry about it. Wait. So you massage that in. You get all the juices out. It gets liquidy. Keep massaging. Then have a jar ready and have that dishwasher clean. So like it's clean, but you don't have to like sterilize it or anything. Just clean. Pop the cabbage in there with its juice. You can add herbs. You can add like some garlic in there. You can add some spices, whatever you like, or just simple. And then make sure the juice is covering the cabbage. If it's not, boil some water, cool it, and then add that. So like just make sure it's submerged. You want it to be anaerobic. And then use the external leaf of your cabbage as like a lid, so you can push it down and just keep the external cabbage and shut that, right? After a day, you'll start seeing bubbles, and leave that like on the side in the kitchen, but not in the sunshine. So out of the sunshine. And you'll start seeing bubbles rise up, and it'll start to like change color. So especially if you use red cabbage, it's really cool to see how it changes. Wow. And every other day or so, you burp it. Sounds so gross, but you basically open the lid to let the gases out and then close it again. And after like 3 or 4 days already, so especially if you finely chopped it, it's already a sauerkraut. Wow. And people are like, how do I know if it's gone wrong? Trust me. You do. Like it obvious. Stinks. And if there's anything growing on it, like, no, you don't want that. It's really obvious. What it smells like when it's lacto fermented is like this acidy, like almost vinegary smell. Not vinegar, but that kind of smell. And so you leave it 4 days. I like to leave it for a bit longer, say like 7 days. And then you have your sauerkraut. And you pop it in the fridge, and then that's it. Like you can keep that for weeks because it's a live product, but that's just been put to sleep in the fridge. And it's acidic, which keeps any pathogens out, basically. So it's like a self-preservation thing. And And it's so good for us because you've gone from the humble cabbage, which has got fiber and polyphenols and it's good for you, to this fermented food, which has got probiotic strains growing on it, the postbiotic product of the breakdown. So it's got like loads of vitamins and amino acids that you would never find in a cabbage. And then the polyphenols have transformed and there's now different other types of polyphenols. So it's fantastic. And you can eat that and your gut will love you for that. Or you can buy it in the store if you're a bit scared of making it. But just make sure, for the store-bought ones, like make sure it says live fermented. If they've added vinegar to it, you just killed the microbes. Yeah.
That's interesting. All right. Before we go, where should people find you? And you just wrote an awesome book.
One other thing, like
What?
water should be your main drink.
Well,
Sounds obvious.
Yeah.
But like water.
What about all of the bubbly water?
The bubbly
right
water,
now?
LaCroix.
It's water. Should
Is
be
it
your
still
main
This
drink.
is bubbly. But I've heard it
it's-
makes you feel a little bit bloated. It can
So
make
there's
you
actually
feel
weirdly
full.
there's some evidence around sparkling water because it's got a different pH to, obviously because it's carbonated. It's actually not good to eat sparkling water, and it's a minor effect. But technically, when you're eating food, it can impact like your digestion a bit, make it less efficient. I wouldn't worry about it if you're having like a bit of sparkling water occasionally when you eat out, but making sparkling water your main drink wouldn't be my recommendation. So while sparkling water is better than soda, just drink water. And then like kombucha is actually a good fermented food option that at least has some probiotics in it. But, you know, I do see people drinking all sorts of juices and smoothies. I mean, I've seen protein water, which I never thought I'd see, but here we are. So just like and especially if you've got kids, make water the main drink in the home. We see children drinking apple juices, or like Vimto type. Do you have Vimto here? Like these like cordials in their bottles, in their baby bottles. Don't start that. So like we know that sugar sweetened beverages are one of the most strong predictors of ill health. There's no doubt about that. That's why we even have the sugar tax, right? Don't start that. Like water is the drink, and that includes not really overexposing your kids to juice, which, you know, might be unpopular. And I'm not saying children should never drink an apple juice or an orange juice, but it shouldn't be a main drink. So I think that's a last thing. And we didn't even touch on alcohol, but
I was going to swing you by the
know
alcohol aisle in
later,
this
so the
grocery
alcohol,
store.
I think, you know, I think we could just, one sentence I say about alcohol
Yes, perfect.
is that it is a neurotoxic carcinogen that has teratogenic effects on developing embryos, and very hard to defend drinking alcohol regularly, especially into older age. Like the effects of alcohol drinking on the brain in older age is mad to me.
Right.
You know.
One sentence I would say about alcohol would be that a study came out looking at the different risk factors for young onset dementia that we've talked about before.
Right.
Alcohol use disorder was a risk factor for the development of dementia in the young.
Right.
But interestingly, alcohol abstinence was also noted to be a risk factor for young onset dementia.
But is that one of those studies where alcohol abstinence was a result of sobriety?
Yeah, so we don't know. I mean,
we don't know.
It's the UK Biobank study.
Is it? So there's a lot of like the studies that were looked at for alcohol being protective used to not account for whether the abstinence was due to recovery or whether it was from birth. And obviously there's a confounder there. If somebody has had an alcohol use disorder and is now sober, the impact of the addiction is still going to be felt. Yeah, so I'm very wary of those. You know, it's
that's a great explanation, because the only one that I've come across is, oh, well, you're, you know, a communal atmosphere and being involved in your community is really important and can also be a preventative factor for dementia.
Yes.
So abstaining from alcohol maybe keeps you from doing that.
Yeah.
That's really the only explanation that I've seen.
Right.
It wasn't very satisfying of an explanation to me. But
and I think if you look to cultures where drinking is not allowed, you don't see this effect. So it's interesting. Like, I drink alcohol, by the way. Like, if anyone's wondering, like, I will have the occasional glass of wine or champagne, but it's so occasional, like the occasional bit. And people say, what about the blue zones? And like the blue zones, they are living a different life. They have resilience is very high, great diets, strong social connections, physical activity all day, living outside, like growing their own food. Drinking alcohol that they make themselves, like
Drop in
with
the
their
bucket.
family. Their body's ready for that. But here we are drinking our lunch, sitting in our cars, like eating
the last
plastic.
straw that broke the camel's back is the alcohol.
Eating no fiber. It's like, oh, and also have this.
Right.
And it's pro-inflammatory for the gut. So so it's like if you do drink alcohol, I think it's just about really hitting that sweet spot of occasional, like, do I actually want to drink today? Okay, I'm going to have one glass of wine with a meal and enjoy it. But unfortunately, also, most of us don't have that relationship with alcohol. Like, I know I'm lucky that I can do that.
Right.
Most people find it very tricky to have that. So if in doubt, cut it out.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Where can people find you?
So I'm on like all the social platforms, Dr. Frederica Amati. Yeah, my book is awesome, but I don't have a US publisher yet. So like,
oh really?
God, yeah.
Well, they can buy it
on Amazon.
Yeah, on Amazon.
Great.
That's what I've been listening to on the audiobook.
So Audible, right?
Yeah.
So it's available there, and I read it. So if you want to hear more of my voice,
yes, which I was surprised because I don't think Dr. Spector didn't read his.
No, he doesn't like doing. It's really hard. By the way, like
I'm sure.
It was. I did it in 3 days, and it was intense.
Yeah.
Like, and just hearing yourself all day.
Did you try to correct sentences as you were moving through it?
100%. So that you can find me there, and then I do on the Zoe Science and Nutrition podcast where I come in and tackle like the protein and the vitamin D, the controversial ones. Yeah. So I'm also there.
Yeah, that's a great podcast too. I was listening to it before this. So.
Oh, good.
All right. Anything else?
No, I think that was incredible. I mean, the thing I like best about hearing you speak about all of this is it's balanced. Right. It has to do with a relationship with food. Mm-hmm. I think it all comes down to how we behave more than anything else. We could talk about all of the nuances, but at the end of the day, is that a sustainable behavior that leads to other benefits outside of just eating, like having a good intuition about sensations you get in your body. I mean, just that practice when you're eating, which is a huge percentage of your day, is going to bleed into other aspects of your life.
It's true, like, because I think once you start doing that you then tap into things like, how do I feel when I don't sleep? Right. How do I feel when I exercise? And I talk about that for women, there's a generation of us, and it's changing now, but like who were on birth control for so long that we didn't know how it felt to be at different points in our cycle. Wow. And like reconnecting with that as it's a really important marker of health and of fertility, of course. But there's all these things that when you start, and food is the one to start with, and it's harder to learn later. Of course, as we age, our satiety signaling and our thirst signaling starts to wane. So if you haven't nailed it earlier in life, it's harder to maintain that later. And it's actually quite an important way to like decrease the risk of becoming dehydrated or not eating enough in older age, which is a problem.
Incredible. I think a big thank you. Thank you for teaching us, inspiring us, and helping us be better.
Thanks for having me. It's been really fun.
We appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Most importantly, be better. See you guys.